My cousin Ethan and I grew up together, but I never liked him very much. His family was rich, so he always had the best stuff. Mine wasn't, and I didn't. On Halloween of 1985, we were going trick-or-treating together. I was the Terminator. He was Freddy Krueger. His mask cost almost $100, and it looked exactly like Freddy's face. The scars, the sneers, everything was just right. I didn't have a mask. My parents couldn't afford one. I had torn aluminum foil taped to the side of my face. It was meant to look like the Terminator after some skin had been ripped off. A few splotches of ketchup on the foil were supposed to look like blood. As soon as it dried, it looked very little like dried blood, and very much like dried ketchup. Despite my terrible costume, I was still excited to trick or treat. We didn't have candy very often at home, except maybe on Easter. My parents encouraged me to go to as many houses as I wanted to get all the candy I would be able to eat. It felt good to know they wanted me to be happy. Ethan and I went out at sundown and visited house after house. Every time the homeowners would gush over Ethan's mask, they would tell him how scary it was, how realistic. Then they would turn to me and ask me who I was supposed to be. I would answer, and then they would say something like, "Oh, of course. How could I have missed it?" I could tell they felt sorry for me. One even handed me a few extra pieces of candy. When we were done, our pillowcases were stuffed with treats of every sort. We began the long walk back home. As we went, Ethan rooted around his bag of loot. I could hear him grumbling and complaining through his mask. Then he started throwing candy on the street, stuff he didn't like.
Go ahead and pick it up if you want it, Bill. I know you can't afford to let anything go to waste.
He called out, heaving handful after handful into the gutter. I didn't say anything, but I reached into my pocket and pulled out a lighter and 2 cigarettes I had stolen from my dad. I had been smoking on and off for the last few months. Even at 13, I knew it was bad for me. I just didn't care. It made me feel good. I stayed a few steps behind Ethan as he tossed more candy away. As much as I hated myself for it, I ended up picking up a few pieces off the ground and putting them in my bag. Ethan caught me once and laughed.
You're gonna be as fat as your mum if you eat all that.
I kept my mouth shut.
Is that why she got fired from the restaurant? Did she eat a customer's food?
I knew Ethan was joking, as he did often. I'm sure in his mind he thought he was being harmless and playful. Still, I told him more than a few times to leave my mom out of the jokes. She had diabetes, and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone other than my dad and me, but the doctor told her that she might end up losing her foot. That's why the restaurant had to let her go. She couldn't walk around and wait tables anymore. "Change the subject, Ethan," I said. I knew he heard me, and he didn't talk for another minute or so, until he did again.
Hey, you think her and your dad still fuck? I wonder how he even manages to get it in there.
He cackled, then insisted.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm done. Promise.
I seethed as we took a shortcut through the elementary school soccer field.
Let's stop here for a minute,
Ethan said. We had gotten to the school's playground.
I bet I could scare the shit out of some kids if they come by.
He sat on one of the swings, with his pillowcase on his lap. He kicked his legs, and the swing moved back and forth. I stood there, hating him. "I think I see some kids coming over the hill," I told Ethan. "I'm going to hide behind the slide and sneak up on them if they come over to you."
Go for it,
Ethan told me, his voice deep and distorted through the mask. I left Ethan on the swing set and walked over to the slide. I watched him on the swing as his hateful words rang in my ears. Tears came to my eyes as I remembered my mom smiling from her spot on the couch as she encouraged me to go out and have fun. She was such a good person. She never said anything negative about Ethan. In fact, she always complimented him on his grades and his wins in basketball, and even his looks. "You're going to be a handsome man someday, Ethan," she told him. "I bet we'll see your face in a magazine someday." Even after her kindness, Ethan still felt it was okay to trash her. I heard him laughing to himself across the playground. I didn't know why exactly. but I thought I had a pretty good idea. I reached in my jacket pocket for another cigarette, knowing a smoke would calm me down. But it had come apart. My pocket was full of loose tobacco and paper, and the lighter. Ethan was still laughing as I fingered the lighter in my pocket for a second. Then I pulled it out. I walked up behind him. Ethan didn't know I was there as he shouted,
"Okay, one more thing, and I'll never say anything about her again. But unless your dad's got a big dick, he'll never manage to."
I flicked the lighter near the back of Ethan's neck, right where his hair and the mask met. The hair went up quickly, using his hairspray as an accelerant. Then something happened I didn't expect. The mask burst into flames. Ethan jumped off the swing and ran in a loose circle, trying to pull the mask off his head. I saw it ripping under his fingers. He couldn't get a grip. The material bubbled. His screams barely muffled as the molten chemicals clung to his skin, echoing off the brick walls of the elementary school. After a few seconds, he fell and rolled around on the playground, pushing his head into the sand to try to put out the fire. He succeeded, but the damage was done. He turned over on his back, no longer screaming, but gasping and shallow hyperventilated breaths. In the moonlight, I saw the mask was completely fused to what remained of his skin. One of his eyes had completely burst, but his other darted around, almost like he was confused and wondering where he was. I saw something moving on the other side of the field. Kids were coming. I yelled to them to call an ambulance, and I waited, unsure of how I felt, until the paramedics got there. I took complete responsibility for setting Ethan on fire. I said I had been sneaking up to scare him by flicking the lighter near his face. And yes, I got into a lot of trouble, but everyone believed it was an accident. Ethan's face was destroyed. He had skin grafts and bone grafts and all sorts of reconstructive surgery, but he never recovered, not physically or emotionally. He killed himself in 1990. His parents held a very expensive funeral. I was invited. They had forgiven me for my part in his accident years before. In fact, their subsequent lawsuit against the mask company is the reason why Halloween masks are now made with flame-retardant materials. My mom died a few years before Ethan, but not before complications from her diabetes took her left leg. Dad and I were with her in the hospital. At the same time, Ethan's parents were there to see him through another round of reconstructive surgery. They visited Mom, Dad, and I while Ethan was still recovering after a successful set of grafts. We chatted for a while about Mom's hopes for recovery, and then the topic moved to Ethan. Ethan's mom was gushing about how a plastic surgeon had recently joined the hospital after working in Switzerland. He was the best, apparently. He had taken on Ethan's case earlier in the year, albeit remotely. He wrote a substantial article about the new techniques he would be employing. In the world of plastic surgery, it made a big splash, if only for its ambition. Ethan's mom reached into her purse and pulled out the publication. She flipped it open to the page that showed various photographs of Ethan's burns, along with notes and explanations the doctor had written to accompany the article. I could tell Mom was holding back tears. I knew why, too. Her eyes met mine, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She began to weep. Dad and Ethan's mother held her while she cried. I just watched. Mom was thinking that she had been right all those years ago. She had been right for all the wrong reasons, but right nonetheless. Just like she had predicted, Ethan's face had finally made it into a magazine.
On Halloween night 2002, 21-year-old Chris Jenkins, a University of Minnesota student, went to celebrate the spookiest night of the year down at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill with his girlfriend, Ashley Rice, and 3 other friends. Shortly after midnight, Chris was separated from his friends and ejected from the bar. According to reports later given to police, a drink was accidentally spilled on his pants, and the security supervisor assumed that Chris was so intoxicated that he urinated himself. After Chris was removed, the security guard in question was given instructions not to let him back inside. Unfortunately for Chris, since his Native American Halloween costume had no pockets, He had asked Ashley to keep his wallet, keys, and cell phone in her purse for him, and his coat was left inside the bar on what turned out to be a chilly 20-degree night. Since he was not the designated driver, Chris was unable to get a ride home and could not contact his friends inside the bar. He was last seen headed away from the bar on foot, but did not return to his residence and was eventually reported missing. On February 27th the following year, Chris Jenkins' bloated, decaying corpse was found floating beneath a bridge on the Mississippi River. He was still dressed in his Halloween costume and had gotten wedged in the branches of a large tree located next to the upper St. Anthony Falls Dam. The medical examiner found no signs of foul play on Chris's body, so the official cause of death was listed as drowning. Despite the police ruling it a death by misadventure, his family launched their own independent investigation and discovered a number of odd discrepancies. The Jenkins family hired a private detective, Chuck Loesch, to further investigate their son's disappearance. When Loesch questioned staff at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, they maintained that Chris left the bar on his own, and the venue's owner eventually issued a gag order instructing employees not to speak to anyone without an attorney. Loesch also contacted the Federal Reserve Bank, who happened to be the owners of the 2 CCTV cameras that had a good view of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. The bridge was on the route that Jenkins was likeliest to have taken, but when the bank checked the surveillance footage from the earlier morning hours of November 1st, there was no sign of him. Loesch's investigation also led him to multiple witnesses who each independently recalled a fight that had occurred in front of a local pizza place. Though it was unclear if the victim was Chris, a gang of around 9 or 10 people had violently attacked another outside of the restaurant. Mike Casey, an off-duty police officer, was present in the area on the night of Jenkins' disappearance. He was moonlighting as a security guard for the nearby Hennepin Center for the Arts and was introduced to Jenkins by his girlfriend, Ashley Rice. Ashley happened to work at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill and was familiar with Casey, well enough that she had borrowed pieces of his uniform to complete her cliched sexy cop costume. There are rumors that Casey had in fact masterminded Jenkins' removal from the bar as a way to get to Ashley, given that he actually gave her a ride home later that night when her shift finished. The Minneapolis Police Department never formally questioned Casey, but stated that he's a married man with children. We don't want to break up a family. An incriminating statement, indeed. The Jenkins family went as far as hiring 2 separate groups of bloodhound trackers to trace Chris's scent from the Lone Tree Bar across the street to an underground parking garage. The scent trail led to parking stalls that one of the bar's bouncers was reportedly parked in on Halloween night. A bloodhound produced a mild hit for Chris's scent on this person's vehicle. Droplets of blood residue, a piece of red string, and red feather fragments which possibly belonged to the headband of Jenkins' costume were also found in the garage. Jenkins' blood alcohol was only 0.12%, so he could not have been particularly drunk, but coroners noted that traces of GHB were found in Chris's system. However, since GHB is a substance which is produced by the body naturally, this did not necessarily mean Chris was drugged. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden took issue with Jenkins' body being found with his arms crossed in front of him. Drowning victims who accidentally fall into water are almost always found face down with their arms outwards towards their sides and their clothing disheveled. Yet Jenkins' shirt was tucked into his drawstring pants and his oversized slip-on moccasins were still on his feet. This led to speculation that Chris was already dead when he was placed in the river. Hydrologists who studied the Mississippi River were highly skeptical that Chris's body could have been in the water for as long as 4 months without ever being seen, as the river did not freeze over until January 2003. What's more, the area beneath the 3rd Avenue Bridge was searched in the weeks following his disappearance, with no sign of him. A daytime thawing occurred on February 27th, the day Chris was found, so he possibly floated from another location before his body got wedged in the trees. Jenkins' family found it extremely unusual that there was no bruising on his body. Their son was an enthusiastic lacrosse player, a goalie in fact, who often came home from practice with huge purple and yellow patches on his legs and forearms. Since these bruises were not present, his parents believed he may have been alive for a couple of days after he went missing, allowing enough time for his bruises to heal. 3 years later, in 2006, the Jenkins family met with Minneapolis Police Chief Tim Dolan, who had decided to reopen the investigation based on the newly attained evidence. Chris's death was eventually reclassified as a homicide, and Chief Dolan held a press conference to issue a formal apology to the Jenkins family. Years later, Dolan would state that he estimated Jenkins' death was 50% chance of homicide, 30% chance of accidental death, and 20% chance of ending his own life. Once the case of Jenkins' death was reopened, an informant told authorities he had witnessed somebody throw Chris's body off the Hennepin Avenue Bridge into the Mississippi River. But there was skepticism about this story since Chris had no broken bones or injuries, and it would not have been possible to toss him over the bridge's high safety railing without his body hitting a steel support beam and vertical metal cables on the way down. In July 2007, the Hennepin County District Attorney's Office announced that they had been approached about filing charges against a suspect for Chris's murder, but declined to do so. The suspect in question was one Jeremy Alford, who was serving a life sentence for the brutal murder of a man by the name of Douglas Miller. Alford admitted to being a regular drinker down at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill around the time of 2002. Chris's case also had been connected to the infamous smiley face killer, as his death took place around the same time that many college-aged men in the Midwest were discovered dead in bodies of water after a night of drinking. But unlike many of the other cited cases, no smiley face graffiti has ever been discovered in relation to Chris's death.
I thought it would be kind of fun to share a spooky event that happened to me a few years ago around Halloween. I had just moved to my current flat in Rains Park, southwest London, and I was fairly unfamiliar with the area. Now my current bosses and supervisors know that I'm fighting a losing battle when it comes to the reliability of the Southwest trains, and as a result have less than reliable timekeeping when it comes to arriving to work on time. A battle that I had hoped to circumvent with the purchase of a bicycle. Sadly, though, the London weather and my inherent idleness jointly conspired to once again force me to take the trains to and from work. While some people are more than aware that the trains keep me from arriving to work on time, not many of you are aware of the troubles I have returning home. That is to say, I have many a time found myself stuck at Clapham Junction with no train to take me back to Rains Park. In these circumstances, I have to take a bus to Wimbledon Common and walk the remaining 3 miles on foot. It is actually quite a pleasant walk. London doesn't have many hills if I walk along the Ridgeway. You can actually occasionally catch a nice view. True, it is of Croydon, but a nice view nonetheless. Now, to call Wimbledon Village a privileged area would be an understatement. The driveways are home to sports cars and luxury utility vehicles, so you can imagine I have very uneventful walks home. I rarely see anyone on the trip about, from the odd older couple, perhaps walking home from a late dinner party, or even a person walking their dog. The neighborhood is quiet and gets to bed early, and that night was just like the others, initially. I had gotten off the bus at the War Memorial, walked through the village center, and turned onto the Ridgeway. My phone battery had died somewhere between Wandsworth and Southfields, so I had to do the walk without music, and this always made the walk seem longer. My usual practice was to walk along and look at the houses and try to guess what the people that lived in the houses would be like. Fast car, business types, SUV and toy still in the front yard, larger family, that kind of thing. I was playing my game and decided to have a cigarette, so I stopped. I was searching for my lighter and looking around when I noticed that I was not the only one on the street. Now this was unusual but hardly alarming. What was strange, however, was that the person wasn't the sort I had grown used to seeing. It was a young lady. She appeared to be drunk, or tired perhaps. I lit my cigarette and paused for a second, just a quick second to judge to see if she would be capable of making it home by herself, or perhaps maybe she would need me to call someone for her. It was at this point that I realized that she was crying. I started to walk over to her to make sure she was alright. She stopped walking and immediately froze. I noticed that she was in some sort of Halloween costume, a schoolgirl in fact. And as I got closer, I began to realize that she was in fact around the age of 15 or 16. She was deathly white. Her makeup must have been professionally done, or she had spent an incredibly long time preparing it. I began to think that maybe her friends had made fun of her costume, and she had run off from whatever party she had been at, drunk and upset. I started to feel a bit unnerved when I noticed that she was staring directly at me as I approached. I can assure you that in a city the size of London, we have an unspoken rule of avoiding eye contact with strangers at all costs. It was at this point I assumed that she was under the influence of something other than alcohol, and I decided to be a bit more cautious. I stopped about 4 or 5 feet away from her and spoke. "Are you okay? You seem to be a little upset. Are you in any sort of trouble?" Nothing from her part aside from that stare. "Have you had a little too much to drink? Maybe some smoke?" "Yeah, right. I know hallucinogens when I see them." There was still no response. "Do you need a taxi home? Do you remember where you live?" At this, the girl began to cry, but this time, she was absolutely wailing. I could feel her raw sense of despair. I actually flinched at the sound. It was positively unbearable. She was dancing on the border of hysterics, perhaps even putting one foot along the line to see what would happen. I was stunned. I wanted to console her and run in equal measures. I wanted to comfort her and chastise at the same time. All I managed was a meek, "Why are you crying?" She must have heard me somehow, because she began to draw herself back from the edge of what can only be described as a complete breakdown. She was still heavily sobbing, but once again, she brought her eyes up to mine and said, very softly, "Because you're gonna die." Now, I've been unfortunate enough to witness death firsthand on more than one occasion. Suffice it to say that these events have always left me with a lot to think about, and I in fact have come to terms with my own mortality quite early in life. It struck me that perhaps, like too many of us had, this young lady had someone quite close to her die recently. Perhaps she was going through the same dark realizations that follow being in the company of death. The same thoughts that can keep children up at nights and the pews full at churches. I wanted to let her know that everything would be fine, and that death was simply a part of life. All I managed, however, was a slightly incredulous, "I know." At this, she seemed slightly taken aback, almost angry. She responded, "You are going to die, and he is going to kill you." Alarms went off in my head. I began to feel a bit more threatened. I decided right then and there that talking this girl down from whatever bad high she was on was no longer my responsibility. Had not the venerable Hunter S. Thompson himself warned us of the dangers of underestimating the ability of a drug to take control of a person? Good luck," I said, and with that, turned and began to walk away. After about 5 steps, I quickly looked back to see her still standing there. She put her head down and began to audibly sob again. I quickened my pace and shortly had walked along the natural bend in the road, leaving her out of sight. I left a bit agitated. I remember putting my headphones back in my ears and trying to listen to music from my phone, only to be reminded that it was still out of power. I was still 2 miles away from home, but at the pace I was walking, I was confident I could cover the ground in less than 20 minutes. No less than 2 minutes later, as when I first heard the shouting. It was a man's voice, layered with an excruciating sense of malice and rage.
"I am coming for you."
I couldn't quite place where the voice had come from, but it seemed as though he was at some distance behind me, on the same road, possibly from where the girl had been. I immediately realized that I was to be the victim of some sort of Halloween prank. I didn't, however, slow down. I imagined at this point that I was supposed to get scared and begin to run. and I was determined not to play along. The man yelled again, and this time he seemed to be significantly closer.
I hate you.
Now the voice had seemed to come from somewhere close by behind me. That is to say, at the volume of the voice, I would have expected to have seen the man addressing me, but I was still very much alone on the street. I was walking quite fast, so the person yelling at me must have been running, yet I heard no other footsteps. There was obviously more than one prankster, and they had various hiding spots along the street. I quickly decided to be a rather poor sport and cut off the main road and go down Thornton Road by the Swan Pub. I hate to admit that their practical joke had gotten the better of me, and I did not want to see what they had in store for me next. I made it to the front of the second house on the street when I heard that terrible voice shout at me again.
You are going to die.
This time the voice seemed to have come from the entrance of the street, less than 80 feet away, perhaps a last chance at scaring me before I disappeared into the darker side of the street. Since these streets were darker, I decided that I would lose no pride in starting to jog down the hill. I knew it was all probably fun and games, but the ferocity of the shouting left me worried that I could in fact be dealing with a real maniac. True, it would have been interesting to be a part of the most elaborate mugging I had ever heard of, but that voice just left me with the impression of true hatred. I didn't want to meet the person, or people rather, that could mimic and channel such malignant feelings at will. I had made it to the curve where Thornton Road becomes Thornton Road, when all of a sudden,
I will kill you.
This time the voice seemed to be directly to the right of me. He must have been hidden behind the fence of some house, or perhaps even within the house itself. I had obviously walked right into their trap. I broke into a sprint at this point. Pride be damned. I began to run quite fast, and then faster, straight downhill. At this point, I actually was starting to panic. My mind was playing terrible tricks on me, and it seemed as though the voices were all around me, constantly yelling at me, constantly screaming. Up ahead was the main road, Whirlpool Road to be precise. Well lit, busy, and I could hail a cab and be home in minutes. But the voices, the immensity.
I hate you, you coward. Die, die, die.
Every second, all around me, the adrenaline must have been heightening my every sense. I admit, I was scared, and it seemed as though for some reason, that terrible voice was booming off every surface on the street. It felt as though I was simultaneously running away and into a mad rage. The words felt like gusts of terrible hot wind, pushing its venomous anger at me. I couldn't take it anymore. The voice seemed to make me share that same intense anger, and I thought to myself, am I the one shouting? And I felt like a victim. I wanted to fucking kill the people who were playing this fucked up trick on me. I felt the hatred.
Time to die, coward. I hate you.
I decided to give up. In one quick moment, I decided I would stop running as fast as I could and have a cigarette and wait for these people to show themselves. I quickly stopped running and spun around. A car beeped as it raced past exactly where I would have run to had I not stopped at that exact moment. In my blind panic, I had run past the sidewalk of the main road and onto the actual road and had avoided being run down by inches. I looked up the road I had come from. Darkness. Silence. Whoever had been up there was gone now. I lit my cigarette and took a few moments to calm down. Smoking had saved my life that night. I went home after that, and nothing more happened to me. But as I was standing there trying to calm down, working through the panic and adrenaline, I seemed to remember hearing a soft whisper. Perhaps it's just my imagination, but I thought I heard a girl's voice, softly saying, "Not such a coward after all."
I was 13 years old when this happened on Halloween night in 2015. Since I had been sitting around all day, at 9 p.m. I decided to go for a walk out in the woods. It was one of my favorite things to do. since everything looked so different out in the dark and that there were no people around. I really loved the cool night air and the spooky feeling of the woods and the nearby pond. I'd started walking past my neighbor's blue house when they were having a huge Halloween party. There were flashing lights at the windows and music blaring, and I could hear all the drunk people raving in the yard. But soon enough, I had made it to the quiet woods like I had planned. As I was walking on the forest path, I started to feel very nervous and paranoid. I couldn't really see where I was going, and eventually had to take my earbuds off to be more aware of my surroundings. The feeling of uneasiness started to fade for a moment as I made it through the woods and onto a street near the one I lived on. I turned the corner back to my street, my earbuds back on, and blasting Nightcore, now almost relieved that I was almost home. I started to think I was being stupid for getting so jumpy over nothing, but then a thin figure appeared from behind the still lively blue house, and I immediately tensed back up. As the figure got closer, I placed my house keys between my fingers like I learned from the internet and tried to make out what I was seeing. The figure was a man, fairly tall, bald, and wearing a black suit. He was also ghost white, and due to my poor vision, I literally almost shit myself thinking it was Slender Man himself coming to take me. A moment later though, I noticed that he did in fact have a face, and he had painted it to look like a skull. The man was obviously wasted, and he was staggering in a zigzag motion across the empty street right towards me. For a split second, I was hoping he was too hammered to even notice me, but that hope quickly faded as he made his way right to me. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. My house was only 2 houses away, but I'd have to get past this unpredictable man, and I had no idea if I could outrun him with my asthma. Panicking, I was considering other ways to get away from him into safety. Could I turn back and maybe take a long way around to the other end of my street? No. It's dark. There's no one around, and I could definitely not run for that long. Can I make it to my grandma's house? Can't do that either. There's no guarantee that she's awake or even home. As I was trying to decide, my thoughts were interrupted as the man put a hand tightly on my shoulder. He started speaking, but I couldn't hear him properly due to my music still playing in my ears. All I managed to hear was him questioning what girl my age was doing out alone so late at night. I could only stand there and stare. The man then paused, raised his arm, and then pointed a finger to the woods behind the houses and then said something. It was at this point that I decided if I didn't do something, soon my body would definitely end up being found in the woods. I looked at the woods, then at the guy, shook him off, and broke into a full-on sprint past him at my house, crossing some of that blue house's property. At my front door, I was furiously stabbing my key into the old rusting lock with my shaky hands, fearing that any second that man would come grab me from behind and drag me into the dark forest on the other side of my yard. I finally managed to get inside and made sure the door stayed locked before I could finally breathe again. I threw my shoes off and made my way into the basement as my tears started rolling down my face. Sobbing, I had told my older brother what was going on, and together we called our parents who weren't home at the time. They said they would check it out, and we didn't call the police, since it was a little town and no harm was actually done. The next day, my dad had informed me that the drunk man was actually just one of the taxi drivers in our town, and we just never spoke of it again. It's 6 years later, and I still get extremely nervous going outside after dark, even though I don't live anywhere near that place anymore. I've told this story to my friends a few times, and it honestly sort of annoys me that I didn't get as much as an apology from that guy. I really honestly hate the whole town, and the fact that no one there does anything when things like this happen. I'm glad I live in a bigger place now, where we at least have street lights. I'm only 19, and I've honestly experienced enough scary and traumatizing things for 2 lifetimes. That being said, I'm very street smart and always have been. I live right in front of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. This particular story happened when I was in 8th grade. Names have been changed for obvious reasons. My friend Jess threw a little Halloween party at her house on the night of Halloween. There were 4 other girls as well as 2 guys besides me and Jess. Megan, Cara, Emily, Bella, Chris, and Zach. Everything was going just fine, and we all took pictures in our costumes, and then took Jess's little cousin trick-or-treating around the neighborhood for a while. I'd also like to add that this was in a decent neighborhood, and crime doesn't really happen in this area. After taking her cousin trick-or-treating, we went back to Jess's house and grabbed hoodies since it was getting cold out, and we decided to walk around. Jess grabbed her Beats pill, and the 8 of us walked around the neighborhood together with the music on low, just barely enough to hear it unless you were near. We didn't see anyone out trick-or-treating anymore, so we decided to go park near Jess's house. It was about 9 o'clock or so at this point, so it really wasn't too late at all. The playground and the swings were at least 50 yards from the sidewalk, and you had to walk through a large open field in order to get to it. The playground was hidden due to a bunch of large trees surrounding the playground. You would really only be able to see it if you were walking on the sidewalk or in the trees. Once we got to the playground, we all put our phones and Jess put her Beats pill on the park bench, and we headed straight to the playground to just hang out. Everybody was all having their own individual conversations with one another, considering there were 8 of us. I was sitting next to Cara and Jess on the playground, while Mega, Emily, Bella, and Chris were sitting on those bars/walls of the playground. Zach was the only one not on the playground. When we all briefly glanced at a group of men with their hoods up, coming right out of the trees near the sidewalk that was about 40 yards away. They weren't doing anything, but they were beginning to walk along the sidewalk that we were just on before. We didn't really think anything of it, so we just minded our business and continued chatting amongst each other. About a minute or so later, everybody gets quiet, and Cara jumps up randomly and begins running off the playground. Roughly 2 seconds later, I see Megan, Bella, Emily, Chris, and Zach all gone and out of sight. Jess and I were sitting on the playground, a bit hidden, and were very confused as to what was going on. I then turned around, and I saw either 5 or 6 men, all dressed in black, each wearing masks, all with long knives or metal baseball bats in their hands. They weren't running, but they were walking very fast towards us. I knew there was something wrong the second I saw their demeanor, almost like they were up to something. And for anyone asking how I knew they were men, they were very tall and had a really big build underneath whatever they were wearing. I looked at Jess, and she was just as scared as I was, considering all our friends had left us behind without even saying a word. The men were right next to the park benches that we had left our phones on, still walking fast. And Jess, not thinking clearly, decides to run up to the park bench and grab her Beats pill, out of fear that they were going to steal it. I waited for her, because I knew I couldn't live with it if she got caught by them. At this point, Jess starts running back towards me so we can get the hell out of there. Jess and I start panicking on what to do or where to go because this park is so secluded and all we're surrounded by is trees. I turn to see where my friends went, and I see a couple of them climbing rocks that led to a fence that basically has nothing but forest behind it. That's when I then see a couple of the men start chasing after them on the rocks, and I instantly had to think because I knew that the other men were coming up right behind Jess and I. Jess and I ran towards the end of the fence because we knew we wouldn't get up the rocks fast enough. Jess immediately made it to the other side of the fence where our other friends were, while I, being the 4'11" girl that I am, was absolutely struggling to get over the fence. I looked to my left to see where the men were, and 2 men were sprinting right towards me as they noticed I was struggling to get over the fence. And I swear, maybe 5 seconds before one of the men caught up to me, I was actually able to make it over. At this point, I didn't know where anybody was, and I was all alone. I could see the 2 men getting ready to hop the fence to come after me, and that's when I took off running. I tried to stay low though, because I knew that the other 3 men were still around somewhere, and I didn't know if they had my friends or what the hell was going on. My first instinct was to find the first house I could with the lights on, and luckily enough, it wasn't long before I did. I ran straight through their backyard and then started pounding on their door, without a single care in the world of how creepy that must have been for them. Luckily, they were having a party too, and after I explained the whole situation quickly, the guys in that house went out into the trees to go find these men and go look for my friends. All of my friends and I were safely at this house by this point, but the men that went to go look for them weren't back yet. The ladies in the house called the cops and explained the situation, and about 5 minutes later, the guys from the house came back, and one of them had actually been punched in the face. The cops eventually arrived and checked everywhere we had been. They didn't even see anybody walking in the area, but they did find all our phones still sitting on the bench where we left them. This might not be that scary to some, but it was truly terrifying for me and those I was with, considering we weren't bothering anybody. One of the guys trying to help us got punched. They all had weapons of some sort, and they clearly weren't trying to rob us, or they would have taken our phones that were right there. I never found out who those men were or what their intentions were with their weapons. All I know is I never went to a park late at night ever again, and neither should you. I actually had a pretty decent scare back when I was 14, and I'm in my early 20s now, so some of the more intricate details are a little hazy, but I'll try to tell it as accurately as I can remember. So the story happened on Halloween night in 2013. Me and my 3 friends, Dallas, AJ, and Anthony, had all collectively decided that we would meet up at my house to begin trick-or-treating, as my house was located right next to the wealthier neighborhood in the city. Our game plan to maximize our trick-or-treating efficiency was to start off at my house, then work our way down towards the nice neighborhood, and then loop around. Before we began, Anthony mentioned that he had bought some weed, and so we all smoked some in the alleyway by my house before we began. We made our way through my neighborhood, in a decent bit into the nice neighborhood before we decided to start heading back so we could get to the houses on the opposite side of the street as we started making our way towards my house. Unfortunately, it was already pretty late at this point, and so a lot of the houses had already started turning off their lights. By the time we were almost out of the nicer neighborhood, just about every house had turned their lights off, except for this one that was attached to a bunch of other townhouses. We, being the desperate, candy-starved teenagers that we were, weren't going to let the late hour of the night sway us from our potential earnings. So we all made our way up onto the porch and rang the doorbell. We waited for a decent bit, probably a good 30 seconds, before we finally heard some loud thumping behind the door. It was an older male, probably in his early 40s. He answers the door in a stained tank top and a pair of denim boxers. The guy looked like he hadn't showered or shaved in like a solid week, but he did seem pretty nice though, despite his appearance. And he made some sort of joke about us being the only trick-or-treaters out there, as we had stayed out later than everyone else, and so we deserved a better reward than the rest of them. He told us to wait there just for a moment while he went and got some treats for us. None of us really found his appearance weird, and I partially blame the weed that we'd smoked earlier, as we weren't as paranoid about him as much as we were paranoid that some cops would see us walking down the street and somehow know that we smoked. We heard his thumping footsteps as he walked around his house, and then a couple of minutes later, he then came back with some black DVD boxes. He held them out like a deck of cards, and he told us to take what we wanted. As he said this, he cracked a smile, and I remember thinking about just how gross his yellow, jagged teeth were. We looked at the covers, and they were all adult movies, some of them not even featuring females on the cover. AJ made a comment about the movies, saying we just wanted candy, but the guy just smiled wider with his crooked yellow teeth seeming to stick out of his mouth, and then he said,
I know what kids your age like to do. Don't worry. It's okay. You can trust me. I'm cool.
At this point, me and my friends all began awkwardly shuffling away from the porch, politely declining his offer, when the man put his hands on his underwear, then started rubbing himself as he begged us to stay and then come inside so we could watch movies together. He said that he'd let us eat all the candy we want, and other really disturbing things. While he was still going on his tangent, me and my friends all collectively decided to book it towards my house, pillowcases full of candy awkwardly being shuffled in our arms. We ran out of the nice neighborhood and down this large hill that the nice neighborhood sat on top of, before forking it left onto the city street that would lead to my house. Before we made it out of the nice neighborhood, I remember looking back and seeing the grown man chase after us for the first part, but then giving up shortly after and going back into his house. We eventually made it to my house and went directly into the basement through a set of stairs that was in the back of my house. While we were in there, We all collectively talked about just how insane what happened was, and we wondered if the weed we smoked had made it seem weirder or maybe more normal than it actually was. Either way, we egged his house the next day, and we never went back there for Halloween ever again. This event occurred when I was 10 years old on Halloween night. At the time, I was still a stick-thin girl with nothing to actually distinguish that I was a girl. Especially since earlier that year, I decided I didn't want to be confused with my twin sister anymore. So I'd gotten a pixie cut and I had began dressing in black. At the time, I had no girlfriends, but up the road half a mile was my friend Austin and another mile and a half up, Quinn. I had really become close with them and would often go exploring and fishing with them, so it was only natural that we decided that the three of us would go trick-or-treating together. Compared to Austin in my neighborhood, Quinn's was the more wealthier one, so in hopes of getting the best candy, we decided we'd go to Quinn's. I had been to Quinn's house a few times, but most of the time we hung out, we'd walk another mile up from Quinn's to the Rudders, which was our local gas station for Slurpees, and then another 2 miles down from my house to the park and lake. So Austin and I weren't too familiar with this neighborhood and the ones around it. But I digress. My mother had a new boyfriend at the time, so she didn't really care what I was doing. She would have gotten mad if she'd known I was hanging out with boys again. It was Pennsylvania, so it was super cold. So any costume I had on was pretty much covered with my jacket and leggings. I had been a dark fairy, so you could still guess what I was just because of the black sparkly wings. Anyways, I had left early to go walk to Austin's house. When I got there, I had to ask Austin what he was because he was in a white button-up, black dress pants, as well as a tie and a heavy black jacket over it. He moved his jacket to show me the cheap sheriff's badge attached to his belt and told me he was a detective. I had laughed and his parents shooed us away. I remember his dad grumbling about what was a boy doing with sparkly wings, when I then realized he'd been talking about me, which definitely dampened my spirits. Austin's dad was drinking though, so I didn't correct him. Austin attempted to cheer me up the entire way to Quinn's house, and soon all was forgotten. Quinn's house was the biggest house I had ever been at the time. It was in a really nice neighborhood with houses on each side that looked just like his. Quinn's mother welcomed us warmly, and she had gave us treats to start off our trick-or-treating. Quinn definitely had the best costume of all of us. A realistic-looking Grim Reaper robe with a black screen over the face, with red glowing eyes, and a plastic bloody sheath. Quinn's neighborhood was swamped with kids from my school, and soon we had gone through almost the entire neighborhood, with our bags really weighing us down. It was getting late, but Quinn wanted us to continue on, and Austin and I were in no rush to go home, so we agreed despite how dark it was getting. Quinn had told us that there was a shortcut to the other neighborhood through his backyard if we went down the hill and then through the trees for a while. Now, that kind of freaked me out, but being the only girl, I wasn't about to let on that I was scared. So I gulped when this was suggested, but nodded my approval, and off we went. Quinn had taken off his mask to better see as we stumbled down Quinn's backyard and decides to leave his sheath behind. We start through the woods, and within about 5 minutes of walking and joking, we all then realized that none of us had thought to bring a flashlight. But it was fall, so there were no leaves on the trees, and light from the moon really helped to light up the way, if only enough not to walk into a tree. Austin asks how much longer, and I can tell by the hitch in his voice that he likes this shortcut just about as much as I do. Before Quinn can answer, we hear a crunch from somewhere up ahead of us, and we all freeze as Quinn sticks up a hand in the air to silence us. "Did you guys hear that?" Quinn says. I remain silent, but Austin snorts and replies, "Stop it, Quinn. That's not going to work. You're not going to scare us." Quinn gasps and then says, "I'm not joking. I really thought I heard something." And before I can tell them both just to keep walking, a shape in the darkness catches my eyes. It's up ahead of us, maybe 20 feet. It's dark, so I can't really distinguish anything, but it's only a moment later that no guessing is needed.
Well, hey there, boys.
Came a strange man's reply from the spot. Quinn and Austin turn in horror as the man continues to walk towards us. What? Who are you? Stammers Quinn. With this, a deep laugh bellows out of the man.
Oh, me? I'm the devil.
This whole time he's walking closer to us, but in the silhouette of darkness, I see no signs of this man wearing a costume. No horns or anything. This is my property. What are you doing in the woods? Quinn demands, sounding less brave with each syllable.
Oh, me? I'm just out for a stroll. I don't really get out nearly as often as I'd like.
He responds smoothly. Now he's about 10 feet from us, halfway peeking out from behind a tree. Quinn, let's just get out of here, I say. But Quinn, in a moment of bravery or stupidity, which is debatable, yells out to the man. What the hell's wrong with you? Stop talking to us. We're just trying to get through. And with that, Quinn nudges Austin and I and begins making a wide turn around the man, who silently watches us and spins around the tree with just his head and hands sticking out to watch us as we walk past. Austin then says to me, "It's Halloween. He's just trying to scare us." I don't respond, just keep my eyes locked on the man. He then yells,
I hope I haven't scared you boys. I just really like your costumes. Why don't you come closer and let me have a better look?
Immediately that comment sent up red flags to me, because you couldn't tell what Austin was, especially at a distance, and with Quinn's hood and sheath gone, you couldn't tell what he was either. That left me, and I didn't like that.
Hey you, boy with the wings. Come over here. Let me help you fly.
And with that, he just started laughing again. Now, I had been getting bullied for how short my hair was, and Quinn and Austin knew how much it hurt me every time I was mistaken for a boy, so they had taken up to sticking up for me, and unfortunately, tonight was no exception. Hey, stop talking to her, you creep! Austin yelled, and with that, he picked up a rock and threw it at the man. It bounced off the tree where the man was half covered, and the man suddenly did a creepy little half jump, half dance, and clapped his hands.
Her? You're a girl? That's even better.
And with that, he, much like a wild animal, bounded forward, hands first on all fours. I immediately dropped my candy, and all three of us began screaming our heads off and running. I don't think he chased us long, but with the crunching under our feet and our screams, it was pretty much impossible to tell. I quickly had to abandon my wings too, as they continued to get stuck to branches as we weaved through the trees in pure terror. We didn't stop until we made it through the trees and onto a well-lit street, though there were very few kids out at this point anyway. We were now over 15 minutes away from Quinn's house and probably an hour plus walk back to my house, and it was only getting later. Quinn had dropped his bag too. Only Austin kept his, clutching it like it were a child. We took the long-lit way back to Quinn's house in almost complete silence, terrified the man would appear again, but he didn't. When we actually made it, we frantically explained what happened, and though sympathetic, Quinn's mom said we couldn't call the police. She said that nothing had happened, and we had no description of the man, and that it was Halloween. The man was probably long gone, and also was almost definitely just trying to scare us. She drove Austin and I home, and I ended up getting grounded for being out so late and also leaving my costume behind. I didn't even bother to explain what had happened, and she didn't seem to notice that I had no candy. The next day, though, I couldn't go out because I was grounded. Quinn came over with his mom and gave me a bag of candy that they had bought, because he knew I had lost mine in the woods. We never talked about it again after that, all convincing ourselves that it was probably just some creepy Halloween prank that went too far. So did the devil, or whoever you are. I really, really hope to never see you again, and especially on Halloween. The story happened to my brother, and it's told from his perspective. On Halloween of 2017, I went trick-or-treating with my friends, who I'll call Harvey, Michael, and Daniel. We were all around 14 to 15 years old, and really just wanted to make the most of this Halloween, as we would have had so much homework starting the 10th grade, and we'd probably never be able to trick-or-treat again. Anyway, we were walking down this random street at like 9:30 when we saw this one house with like really insane over-the-top Halloween decorations that looked like they cost up to $500. The four of us walked up to the house and we rang the bell. Some 50-year-old guy opened the door and then said,
"No need to yell. Just come in and you'll get your sweets."
Daniel told the guy, can't you just bring the candy out here?" The guy didn't even answer, so the four of us just walked away, not saying a single word. But of course, the story wouldn't be scary if it ended here. We were walking down my street when Harvey pointed out, "Guys, I think that man is following us." We all looked behind us and we saw that same 50-year-old man walking about 25 feet behind us. The four of us then bolted all the way down to my house. We were all way too scared to even think about revealing where I lived to this psycho. We thrust open the front door, entered my house, and locked the door. The four of us were just hyperventilating, as if we had just run like a 75-mile marathon. I was starting to calm down when Michael then said, "Dude, look at the window." We all looked, and there he was. The old man was looking through one of my windows. My parents were on vacation at the time, and my older brother was at his friend's Halloween party, so we couldn't tell them. But what really made this horrifying was I could see the guy holding a Saturday Night Special in his hand. We all ran upstairs and called the police. The officers arrived in 10 minutes. The man wasn't on my property anymore, but we remembered the house he was in. The cops went there, searched the whole place, and then came out with the man in chains. As it turns out, the house was vacant, and the man was a serial killer who had escaped prison a month ago. If my friends and I are ever able to go trick-or-treating again, we're definitely avoiding the street that house is on, and who really knows what the guy would have really wanted to do to my friends and I had we been naive enough to enter that house. I will say though, I'm really glad this happened when we were teenagers and not like 9 years old. All I can say is if you're trick-or-treating, make sure the house owner is completely normal. And if a single thing seems off in the slightest, just walk away.
Alexis Sharkey was born in Houston, Texas in the year 1994 to her father, Mike Robinault, and her mother, Stacy. After graduating high school, Alexis initially studied biology education at a university in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but after gaining her diploma, she seemed to be in no rush to get a teaching job and found work at a premium hair and skincare company named Monat. She was still working for Monat when she began to gain a great number of followers on the photography-based social media app, Instagram. A combination of her natural beauty and her champagne lifestyle had users hooked. She and her husband, a wealthy West Texas consultant who was 26 years her senior, were accustomed to vacationing a lot, and Alexis wasted no opportunity to document her travels, sharing pictures with her followers on a daily basis. Not to mention sharing images of the couple's extravagant life around Houston, the place that they'd made their home. Her posts would be seen, liked, and shared by tens of thousands of people, and by December of 2020, Alexis had over 69,000 followers. Now, as you may know, Instagram users with large amounts of followers are often contacted by private companies and offered large amounts of money in exchange for advertising their products, and Alexis was no different. Within a relatively short period of time, whilst still working full-time selling products for Monat, which has since been accused of being nothing more than a multi-level marketing company, Alexis was getting sponsorship deals which made her income swell to even higher levels than her consultant husband. But all was not well in the Sharkey home. A close friend of Alexis confessed that she had recently confided in her that she was filing for a divorce. Some had always doubted their relationship given that Tom was considerably older than her, and aside from an intense attraction, the couple seemed to have very little in common. Yet for some reason, Alexis didn't move out of the apartment they shared, even though she and Tom were apparently separated. However, she did see an opportunity to get a breakaway from Tom, as Thanksgiving weekend gave her the chance to stay over at a friend's place for the celebrations. She told her soon-to-be ex-husband that she would be back by the weekend, but on the Saturday following Thanksgiving, Alexis's mother, Stacy, received a call from Tom saying that Alexis was missing, and that he hadn't heard from her since Friday. A few days later, on November 28th, Alexis's mother posted to the social media site Facebook, stating that her daughter hadn't been heard from in over 24 hours, adding that police were involved and that Alexis had last been seen in the Houston area. This was especially concerning for Stacy, as she hadn't seen her daughter since the previous Christmas due to travel restrictions caused by the pandemic. Alexis had planned to return home to her parents back in Pennsylvania for Thanksgiving, but as the number of cases continued to rise all over the United States, the family decided it was much safer for Alexis to stay in Texas. But that very same morning that Stacy posted her plea on Facebook, a sanitation worker employed by the city of Houston saw something unusual lying on the side of the road. At first, he simply believed it was some kind of mannequin, due to the lack of clothes and the stiff positioning of the thing's limbs. But the worker's supervisor, a man named John Richardson, later said that the employee had sounded terrified when he called him, saying he'd noticed the apparent mannequin looked a little too real upon closer inspection, and that he suspected the situation to be far worse. John drove down to where the supposed mannequin was lying at the side of the road, then rushed to call 911 when he saw that it was no mannequin at all. That it was in fact a lifeless human body. The moment of realization traumatized him, and he later told a local radio station that the sight of the body had been playing in his head every day since he discovered it. 2 days later, on November 30th, Houston Police Department held a press conference in which they announced that they had identified the body as belonging to none other than Alexis Sharkey. Her soon-to-be ex-husband got a call from a local coroner's office, asking him to drive over to identify the body of a potential loved one. He knew immediately that it was going to be Alexis, but somehow found the strength to head on over, where he found her lying on a mortician's table, dead but with no obvious signs of injury. Yet to his horror, after the news of Alexis's death began to circulate in the news, he began to hear rumors that it was his maltreatment of her that had been the cause of her death. Anonymous accounts from people claiming to be friends of Alexis had told a number of online news publications that the separation from her husband had caused a huge amount of tension in their home, a tension that had soured into hatred. These anonymous friends claimed that Alexis herself had told them that some intense arguments had descended into violence more than once, and that her husband had been putting his hands on her. Suddenly, Tom Sharkey found himself bathed in the media spotlight, and for entirely negative reasons. In what became a lightning-quick trial by media, one which was fueled by social media speculation, tens of thousands of furious people assumed that it was Tom that was the murderer, and he began to receive a slew of death threats. It certainly didn't help that initially Tom had refused to comment on his wife's death, but as the threats against him became more and more tangible, he reached out to give a statement to a local ABC affiliate. "She understood me. I understood her. We didn't fight when she left. I just told her she shouldn't drive under the influence," he said, overtly implying that Alexis had been drunk the night that she left her friend's Thanksgiving celebrations. He also seemed to insist that there was no trouble in their marriage, and that they weren't filing for divorce at all. This was something that was backed up by Alexis's mother, who said her daughter would have told her if she was suffering marital problems. When the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences conducted an autopsy on Alexis's body, they told reporters that they couldn't rule out the possibility of foul play. This only cemented her mother's suspicions that she met a violent end. "I believe solely that she was murdered because of the manner in which her body was left," Stacy said. "It just drives deep into the soul that something very malicious happened here, and I want to get to the bottom of it." Friends said she confided in them on a recent trip to Mexico that she feared for her life, although she apparently did not say why she held such suspicions. But if this was the case, just who exactly killed Alexis? Police seem to have pretty much ruled out the idea that she was murdered by her husband, since he was quick to volunteer his cooperation with them in the aftermath of her death, and has since stated that they believe it to be only a matter of time before arrests are made. So perhaps Alexis's murder was related to her career selling beauty products of Monat. Not only has Monat been accused of utilizing the techniques of outlawed, multi-level marketing companies, but the quality of its products has also come into question. In the year before Alexis's death, Monat was allegedly investigated by Florida's Attorney General after hundreds of claims that its products caused a host of hair and skin issues. The company was permanently barred from using false or misleading statements in its marketing and sales of its beauty products, and faced $1 million fine on top of class action lawsuits from those that, after using the products, claim they experience hair loss, balding, and itching. Alexis was a prolific seller of Monat's products, once receiving a check for $10,000 as the winner of a company sales competition. That would certainly make for a lot of women who might blame her for essentially disfiguring them. There's also a decent chance that since Monat's MLM tactics would leave a lot of people out of pocket, that somewhere down the line Alexis had screwed one of her underlings out of a great deal of cash, perhaps just before the news of Monat's subpar products broke in the media, perhaps leaving a person totally unable to shift a hefty amount of stock they'd purchased. This would doubtless leave a person angry, vengeful, maybe even murderous. And besides, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. If this is indeed the case, and Alexis's death is intrinsically linked to her Monat sales, then it seems that her status as an Instagram influencer actually led to her murder. The influence she exerted over those that followed her no doubt led to increased sales, thus increasing the potential pool of victims for Monat's frankly dangerous products. It's very possible that without Instagram, she may not have made the sale to that one person unhinged enough to seek revenge when their skin began to blister, or their hair began to fall out, or their scalp began to itch unbearably. It seems we'll soon find out who's responsible for Alexis's death. But if it is related to social media, it would be very ironic that a medium that has brought opportunity and new beginnings to so many brought one young woman to her end. The 24-year-old Russian Ekaterina Karaglonova had a life that many of us can only dream of having. She was young, beautiful, intelligent, and highly educated. Practicing medicine as a dermatologist after graduating from the Pirogov Medical University, she also held a residency at a prestigious medical school in Russia's capital, Moscow. And to top it all off, she had recently finished second place in a Moscow beauty pageant. Ekaterina was also a prominent social media personality in her native Russia, regularly sharing images of herself with hundreds of thousands of Instagram followers. Known by the handle @Katie_loves_life, she was known to write a blog detailing her luxurious jaunts around Europe, where she posed in locations such as Italy, Austria, and Spain. In her last Instagram photo shows her lounging poolside in Greece, detailing her love for international travel. It was very helpful for a few days to escape from heavy rains and cold to the Ionian Sea. She also captioned the snap of herself holding a glass of wine by a pool. Now I prefer to travel very often, but briefly, study and work do not let go. But the impressions of such short trips remain the most vivid. But one of her close friends, Marina Nikotina, began to notice that all was not well with her seemingly perfect life. She claimed to have observed a drastic change in Ekaterina's behavior during the summer of 2019, and when questioned on it, the well-traveled young doctor confessed that she had made a rather dangerous enemy and that someone is interested in my private life in the worst possible way. Then, in July of 2019, Ekaterina's family contacted the Moscow police, concerned with the fact that they had not heard from her in several days. Friends remarked that she had recently started a new relationship and had been planning a trip to the Netherlands to mark her birthday on July 30th. Most other people might have been busy with travel arrangements or might simply have been too occupied with their actual vacation to get in touch. But as we know, Ekaterina posted to her Instagram account almost religiously, and the fact that she hadn't done so for several days was the thing that alarmed her family the most. Deeply worried for her well-being, Ekaterina's family contacted her landlord, who, after some convincing, allowed them to access her apartment. There they found no sign of anything amiss. Her belongings seemed to be all in order, and there was no obvious signs of violence. But in the hallway was a heavy-looking suitcase, stuffed with something far more than just expensive clothes. Her family were horrified at what they found when they opened it, because what fell out in front of them was Ekaterina's decomposing corpse. She had been dead for almost a week, with a large slash across her throat and several other devastating stab wounds to her chest and abdomen. Upon examining the crime scene, police were unable to locate any obvious murder weapon, and there were no signs that there had been a break-in or any kind of serious struggle. Naturally, police checked her Instagram account for any clues that might point them in the direction of why she was killed. They saw that Ekaterina had alluded to a potential romance on her Instagram account, sharing photos of bouquets with notes attached to them. "Another surprise from Mr. X," she captioned the latest photo, adding, "For several weeks now I have been receiving bouquets and little notes from a secret admirer. I wonder who it could be." It was then speculated that such a public display of romantic interest could have angered a former lover, perhaps someone that couldn't bear to see the young doctor in a new relationship. Police then discovered CCTV footage had captured an ex-boyfriend of Ekaterina's who seemed to have paid her apartment a visit in the few days before contacting her became impossible. Ekaterina had only broken up with 32-year-old Maxim Geryeva a few weeks prior, and she had confided in friends that he had not taken it very well at all, and that he was a wolf. The man enters the Moscow apartment block wearing a baseball cap, apparently to cover his face from CCTV cameras. He is then seen leaving the apartment around 4 hours later, wearing a completely different outfit, which police speculated was because the one he'd entered wearing was now covered in blood. Police soon caught up with Maxim, who told police that the breakup had been hard on him, with Ekaterina repeatedly insulting and humiliating him, despite the fact that he had given her a sizable amount of money in the course of their relationship. Maxim said that she had told him he was ugly and that even a plastic surgeon could not help him. Before they parted, Ekaterina allegedly told him that it would have taken a year before he could save up enough money for them to meet again. This had given rise to theories that the young doctor had taken to resorting to a kind of selling of herself in order to fuel her extravagant lifestyle, charging men exorbitant amounts of money to go on dates with her. It was then that Maxim confessed that he could not stand the kind of treatment and had snapped. He then confessed that he stabbed Ekaterina in the neck and chest area with a knife at least 5 times, saying he regretted what happened and promised to cooperate with the investigation. She half-turned and I struck her in the neck, he says in a recorded confession to Moscow police. She tried to escape to the bathroom and lock the door. I pulled her out of the bathroom. Her blood was dripping down her body. Then in the corridor she started screaming. I covered her mouth and stabbed her again in her chest with the knife. She then ran to the living room and started fighting me, but I was in a state that I didn't feel any pain. During the fight, she fell down and I struck her twice again in the neck. Then she had convulsions and died. Maxim was taken to trial for the murder, and he apparently held his face in his hands in court because he looked bad. Such was the depth of his own vanity. Character witnesses alluded to calling him Ken, a reference to the Barbie doll because he was so obsessed with plastic surgery and his overall appearance. Maxim insisted the murder was not premeditated and told the courtroom it was a spur-of-the-moment thing, something that came about as a result of the rage that he was feeling that Ekaterina had so deeply insulted him and his looks. "I want to apologize to Katya's parents. I am very sorry," he told the Instagram influencer's family before he was taken to a prison outside of Moscow. It seems that the world of Instagram influencers, as well as those who are attracted to its veneer of perfection, are just as prone to becoming victims of its vapid plastic culture as we are. Here was an accomplished young woman who apparently could not bear to be without the trappings of luxury that she evidently felt she was entitled to, who, as a result, involved herself with a man who she believed was so beneath her that she could verbally abuse and shame him publicly with no repercussions. In no way did Ekaterina deserve to die for what she did, but in delving into the superficial lifestyle of an Instagram influencer, what's clear is that she opened up a kind of Pandora's box that seems to have set her on the path to ruin. When 20-year-old Sinead McNamara from New South Wales, Australia, received a job offer to work aboard the super yacht known as the Mayan Queen 4, she saw it as the opportunity of a lifetime. So much so that the Australian part-time model sold almost every single one of her belongings to be able to afford a plane ticket to Europe. She was offered the job partly because she had experience working on similar vessels, but the $190 million luxury boat was by far the most extravagant she'd ever had the opportunity to sail on. It was owned by Mexico's second richest man, billionaire Alberto Bayeres, and it was his home on the high seas as he traveled around Europe, living a life of pure luxury. In August of 2018, the Mayan Queen was sailing around the plethora of Greek islands in the Aegean Sea, and Sinead took full advantage of the gorgeous scenery, amassing around 20,000 followers on her Instagram account. Sinead posted plenty of pictures of herself too, and it's plain to see why the young lady was able to gain work as a part-time model, not to mention how it doesn't take a genius to work out why photographs of a beautiful young blonde surrounded by beautiful Greek vistas attracted so many visitors to her page. But despite presenting an image of a perfect carefree existence, it became obvious to some that the life Sinead was living was far from flawless. At one point, the young woman called her mother back in Australia to complain that she had been involved in an intense argument with another crew member working aboard the Mayan Queen, and that she seemed scared for her safety. The very next day, a passing boat spotted the Australian model hanging from the back of the yacht, tangled up in a series of thick ropes. The crew of the Mayan Queen was alerted, and the captain of the boat, who asked not to be named, said he discovered Sinead's body at around 1:45 a.m. and began screaming for help. Doctors and police tried for around half an hour to revive her, but when she began to slip into a coma, she was rushed to an Athens hospital, but she sadly died in the helicopter that was flying her to the mainland. The man that inspected her body, Greek coroner Ilias Bogiokis, ruled that because of the circumstances in which she died, that he initially speculated that Sinead's death was actually her ending it herself. Since no stimulant drugs such as cocaine or sedatives such as cannabis or heroin had been found after the toxicology analysis, it means that the girl was not under the influence of such substances, he said. She had mental clarity and that she was most likely facing social problems and found herself at a psychological impasse. However, we don't know if someone brought her into this situation, if there was a moral instigator. The coroner also made it clear that questions still remained about the case, and would need to know much more about the events which led up to her hanging to make a clear, definitive judgment on how and why Sinead died. What's horrifying to hear, though, is that Sinead's body was in such a state that the coroner advised her family against viewing her body, even though this is standard practice to identify a person's remains. What was so messed up about her corpse that Greek authorities might forgo such a crucial part of the identification process? After an initial investigation by the Greek Coast Guard, the Mayan Queen 4 was then allowed to leave Kefalonia after interviews with the yacht's crew. The Mayan Queen 4 is equipped with CCTV surveillance cameras, and footage of the incident was seized by Greek authorities. Footage reportedly showed Sinead moments before her body was found, though the video was not made public, and for some reason it wasn't made available to the coroner either. The footage apparently showed Sinead in a very high spirits before her body was found hanging from the back of the boat, that she was dancing on tables and downing cocktails, hardly the frame of mind someone who is about to take their own life. If this is the case, our attention is then drawn to the argument with the other crew members, the same one she complained to her mother about, in which she confessed to being scared. Was Sinead's murder covered up by somebody who co-opted the Greek authorities into helping them sweep the events that preceded her killing under the rug? It's not entirely out of the question that Alberto Baleares, who is worth around $10 billion, would have the financial means to bribe government officials in a country so strapped for cash as Greece. Perhaps even more terrifying than the concept of some murderous conspiracy is the casual indifference with which her death was treated by people online. You live for attention, now you've got it, while another added, unfortunately the steep price you pay with lifestyles like this. But some have insisted there is plenty of evidence to suggest that her death was indeed her taking her own life. In a cryptic Instagram post written just 2 weeks before she died, Sinead wrote, "My head is all over the shop today," along with emojis of a volcano, a tornado, and a needle with blood dripping from it. There was also many who asserted that Sinead had ended a tumultuous romantic relationship a short time before her death, and that this may have contributed to feelings of depression or self-destruction. Her death also occurred on what was reported to be her last day as a crew member on the yacht, raising the question that perhaps she was so depressed to be leaving the lap of luxury, maybe even being forced to return to Australia because there was no more luxury yacht jobs available to her, that she opted to take her own life instead of biting the bullet and return to a life more ordinary, perhaps. And perhaps this is the most terrifying thing of all, that human beings are capable of reaching such height that we're simply unwilling to go on living if we can't continue to live in the way we've become accustomed to. That there's a possibility that at just 20 years old, Sinead had felt she'd peaked, and that everything else to follow in her life would pale in comparison to the time that she spent on the Mayan Queen. So instead of continuing her life with her days on the yacht becoming a happy, albeit distant memory, Sinead may have chosen to end her life in order to, as the saying goes, die young and leave a good-looking corpse.
My name is Shelly, and 10 years ago, I wanted to make my own money because I was tired of asking my parents for money. I put in a lot of applications and I ended up getting hired at Chick-fil-A. I'm not going to lie, I was definitely excited because of all of the chicken nuggets I was going to be eating. Anyways, after I got hired, I started to get the hang of the job. It was pretty easy. I worked outside in the drive-thru line a lot because we were the busiest fast food restaurant in our town, and people really liked my personality. After working there for a few months, my dad's creepy friend Tyler would come there every day at the same time and go to the same drive-thru line, which was weird because I worked there after school and there were 2 drive-thru lines. The drive-thru line he'd always go to was mine, and he would always call me Shell, which I've hated since I was a small kid. The thing is, he'd always order small stuff like a small fry or a small cookies and cream milkshake. A few times he came into the line, pull up to me, and then he'd say that he forgot his debit card, and he would just try and talk to me. I'm not dumb. I knew exactly what he was doing. Ever since I turned 13, he always acted weird toward me, telling me that I'm growing up into a woman, or that I look like a young woman now. There was this time when my parents were having a get-together with family and friends, and I yelled out to my parents that I had to pee, and I ran upstairs. I swear a few seconds later, Tyler burst through the door, looked at me and said, "Wow," and stared at me. Then he straightened up real quick and said, "Sorry, my bad," and closed the door. Like I said, he was weird. So we closed at 10 p.m., but we always take orders up until around 9:59. One day, we were inside cleaning up, and it was around 10:30 p.m. There were about 5 or 6 of us in Chick-fil-A at the time. I was mopping the floor and a few of us saw a car pull up to the drive-thru, but turned around at the entrance because we put cones out there after 10 p.m. The car drove around our parking lot at least 10 minutes, and I noticed that it had temporary tags on it. After a while, our manager went outside and went up to the car due to it stopping in front of one of our windows every time it drove around. I watched the manager walk to the car as the driver rolled down the window. The window was all the way down before my manager reached the car, and to my surprise, it was Tyler, my dad's friend. He had a new car that I didn't recognize, but what made this very weird was that even when he rolled the window down, he never looked at my manager. He was staring directly at me, talking with my manager. I was standing behind the entrance door. He saw me looking at him, looking at me, but he never turned away like a normal person would. My manager walked back in and told me and my coworkers to hurry up so we can get out of here. I was the last person to get done with my closing, so it was just me and my manager. My manager told me to make sure the doors are locked. I told him okay, then I went to the bathroom. I figured I'd lock them once I'm done. As usual, I was on my phone while using the bathroom, and the bathroom door opens. I thought it was weird because my manager is the only other person in the building, and he's a guy. I yelled out that he's an idiot and he's in the wrong bathroom, but the thing is, he never left. It got weirder because I can hear him breathing by the door, but then I heard, Shell, it's me, Tyler Poop. Are you in here? I picked up my feet so he couldn't see them, but then he started to push open every stall door, saying my name. I texted my boss and it literally said, help, bathroom. Then Tyler got to my stall. He attempted to push the door open and then he laughed. He said that he knows that I'm in there. He looked in the crack of the door and said, there you are. He then got down on his hands and knees, reached his hand under the door and attempted to unlock the stall. I kicked his arm and he said, it's me, Uncle Tyler. As he said that, he proceeded to crawl under my stall door. I started to climb above my stall, then my manager burst through the door as I was screaming and crying. Tyler and my manager began to fight. I called the cops. After a few seconds, Tyler was unconscious on the bathroom floor. When the cops and the EMS got there, he was cuffed and loaded up into the ambulance. He was hit with a few charges and was recently released from jail. That situation just heightened my awareness of my surroundings. Back when I was living on the streets, well, technically in my car, I would always post up about fast food restaurants because people would always give me their change or some of the food that they had recently purchased. One day I posted at the entrance of a plaza, and in that plaza the busiest place was a Chick-fil-A. Throughout the day I received a few bucks and a lot of chicken nuggets. After being out there for a few hours, I noticed a car that left a few times and came back to park in the Chick-fil-A parking lot with covered license plates. But the person never got out of the car. Of course, I thought it was weird, but I didn't think anything of it. Throughout the day, I'd take my food to my car and I'd eat. Around 8 p.m., most of the plaza was closing up, and the traffic started to slow down. Finally, when Chick-fil-A slowed down for a few minutes, a man in the car got out and he walked up to the door of the restaurant and took a picture of the inside. A few seconds later, what looked like the manager came outside, and it looked like she was arguing with the guy. She went back inside and the man got back in his car, got on his phone, and left about 5 minutes later. FYI, I was parked about 25 feet away from the Chick-fil-A parking lot and could see everything that was going on. So a few hours go by and the place was closed. From the outside, it looked as if the employees were cleaning up. I was trying to fall asleep, then I saw that car from earlier pull up. Then it woke me all the way up. There were 2 cars left in the parking lot. His car and some other car. And some people left. The only person I saw inside was the woman that he was talking to earlier. I saw the man get out of his car at this point. He was wearing dark colors and with gloves on. And I saw the lights get turned off inside of Chick-fil-A. The man was standing on the side of the building by a dumpster, but in a way where he can't be seen. He was in the shadows. At that point, I leaned my seat all the way back so no one could see me. The woman walked out, turned around, and began to lock the door. As soon as she turned around, that man sprinted toward her, yanked her hair, and started to yell at her as he took her back inside. I leaned up a little bit to get a better look, but I couldn't see anything. There was nothing for about 10 minutes, until the man walked back outside. He went straight to his car, but instead of driving away, he drove up to the door and went back in with his trunk left open. A few minutes later, I saw something that I would never forget. The man was dragging the woman's body, but there was no head. He struggled to get her in the trunk, but eventually he got her there. He went back in there and came out with a Chick-fil-A bag full of something and threw it in his trunk. He went back inside again for what seemed like 20 minutes. He came back out, locked up Chick-fil-A, and drove away. Someone else came back for the other car in the parking lot. A few days later, I went into a Starbucks to use the restroom, and on the news was a story about a missing woman. They showed the picture, and it was the woman who worked at Chick-fil-A. They were interviewing her husband, who was crying during the whole interview. What creeped me out is that her husband was the man that I saw with her that fateful night. I know he killed her, but he was on the news as if he didn't have anything to do with it, and like he doesn't know. Seeing that lady that night has haunted me since.
So first of all, I have to apologize for my English because it's not my first language. But this is definitely one of the scariest and most horrible things I've ever heard. A few years ago, we had this big incident here in the Philippines involving Facebook. This guy's wife was over in Canada for her job, and she got into an argument with the husband via Facebook. I think he wanted her to come home to Quezon early because he missed her or something, and she refuses because her contract isn't finished yet. I'm guessing the husband was being really nasty and unreasonable because for some reason, the wife stops replying to his messages altogether. Now, this couple had a 7-year-old daughter together, one whose picture the media showed a lot in the days after the incident. She was so cute, and it breaks my heart that anything happened to her. But it also makes my blood go cold that anyone could lay a finger on her, especially the girl's own father. Because in response to his wife ignoring him on Facebook, maybe even threatening to leave him, I don't know, he actually kills their daughter. He stabbed her in the neck and chest, then took pictures of the body and uploaded them to Facebook while tagging his wife in the pictures. Can you imagine how horrific that must have been? To get a notification on your phone or laptop or whatever device, seeing you'd been tagged in a picture, only to then see it was your own dead child. Not only that, but your husband, the kid's dad, the one other person in the world whose one job above all else is to protect them, is the one that actually murdered them. That's true horror to me. Like I can't even wrap my head around it. There was video released of him in custody, I think his name was Mark, and the police were showing him pictures of what he'd done to his daughter. And this guy is just screaming and screaming, not being able to believe he'd killed his own child. I think he'd just gone temporarily insane, or however you say it, but the idea that human beings are capable of such horrific things, like when they see red and just black out, and then are able to kill someone so precious to them, that's about the worst thing I can possibly think of. And it just makes it even more sick that something as supposedly harmless as Facebook was involved, that social media can enable us to make horrific things even worse. I always think about this case whenever I hear about Facebook, and I know the majority of the site is just Candy Crush invites and baby photos, but it's tainted my opinion of the site forever. I know Facebook has people that remove all the bad content, but they can't be everywhere all the time. And I wonder how many people saw the pictures of that dead girl before they actually got taken down. Even one is too many, if you ask me. Sometimes Facebook just seems like a powder keg of trouble. It had this weird ability to help exacerbate drama to the point where someone gets hurt. A really good example of this is what happened back in 2012 in the town I live in here in Holland. So there were these two friends of about 15 or 16 years old who went to a New Year's Eve house party together. They ended up getting pretty drunk and having an argument because one of the girls was making out with guys and her friend didn't like it. So the next day, one friend basically calls the other a sleaze on Facebook. So the friend who got called sleazy complained to one of the guys she'd been making out with at the party, who said that if she wanted to, he could teach the judgmental friend a lesson. I think it says a lot about how petty and spiteful teenage girls can be to each other, but the girl who got accused of being sleazy says yes to this, that she wanted her friend to regret saying mean things to her. So instead of just sending over some rude messages or whatever, this guy gets in touch with another friend of his, who agrees to actually go over to this girl's house to beat her up or something. Yeah, actual violence because of a few comments on freaking Facebook. Only he doesn't just slap her around or whatever. He takes a knife over to the girl's house, rings on her door, and then stabs her repeatedly with it. That's when this girl's dad appears to try and defend her. The kid then stabs him too. The girl ended up dying a week or so later in the hospital, and it was a huge news story here in Holland. But I think the really horrible thing is that the kid who did the actual stabbing only spent a year in juvenile detention with a few years of probation afterward. The two kids who organized the killing ended up getting more time in prison than the actual murderer, but even then it was only 2 years. I know the prosecutor tried to get them more time in jail, but that didn't work in the end, and these kids basically got off super lightly for legit murdering someone, and all because of an argument that unfolded over Facebook. That was the hardest part to swallow. The Dutch media even christened the whole thing Facebook moord, as like a nickname which basically just meant the Facebook murder in Dutch. I'm not saying the whole murder wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for Facebook, but honestly, there's no doubt that it made it easier to organize. Like I know for a fact that the older guy managed to get in touch with the guy who actually carried out the attack via Facebook, and maybe he wouldn't have been able to organize that without it. Stuff like Facebook is supposedly there to bring us together, right? So it's just a terrible thought that people can then use it to rip each other's families apart. I'm kind of weird about social media these days. I used to be really into Facebook when I first moved to college. It kept me in touch with family and friends back home, and it was a nice feeling like I wasn't so far away from them. Building up a collection of photos, checking into places, sharing every little detail of my life so that everyone could see how great I was doing. My entire world was online for all to see. And because I'm dumb, I was pretty liberal about my privacy setting too. So one day I get this message request from someone that I've never heard of before. It just said, "Hey." I checked their profile to see if they were in the same class as me or something, but it turned out we had no mutuals, and they lived on the other side of the country. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty confused as to why they're messaging me, but I'm also curious. So I just reply, "Hey man, do we know each other?" I don't know what I was expecting him to say when I saw that he was typing a reply. And I remember thinking that maybe he was looking for someone with the same name as me or something. But then his response pops up and all it said was, "I'm going to kill you," with a cowboy emoji on the end. I stare at the message for a few seconds, not scared at all, just like, what? I mean, the cowboy emoji was what made me take another look at this dude's profile, seeing a bunch more pictures of him shooting guns and wielding knives in the woods somewhere. I mean, that was at least a little intimidating, but what got me were all these rants that he'd posted about how much life sucked, how unfair things were, and how he'd love to take it out on someone who deserved it. And then the videos that were unplayable because they'd been removed by Facebook admins, but still had captions like, "That chainsaw goes through his neck like butter," and a crying laughing face emoji. That's when I started to worry. It didn't seem like this guy was just having fun, playing a prank on a stranger by trying to scare them. He seemed legit crazy and seriously angry. That nutcase could have been studying every one of my statuses, picture posts and check-ins for weeks before he decided to message me. He could have screenshotted all of my stuff too, so it didn't matter if I blocked him or not. He had my name, my school, where I hung out, the names of my family and friends, everything. I thought maybe I was just making a big deal out of nothing at the time, but later on I could barely sleep thinking about it. How horrifying a thought it was that he could have been driving across the country as I lay there in bed, having just picked a person at random to kill and being crazy or angry enough to actually do it. You can call me paranoid all you like, but I just couldn't get this guy out of my head. Like the idea of him hunting me down or whatever was unnerving enough. I mean, he had enough info on me to be able to ambush me at a dozen different places that I just couldn't avoid because they were school or grocery shopping or just my dorm. But what had me freaked out is that creep might have been able to learn so much about me, and I was dumb or vain enough to let it happen in the first place. I knew the internet was full of crazies. I just didn't expect it to reach and touch me in the way that it did. If I didn't make it clear already, I did actually block the guy, but some weird grim curiosity had me unblocking his account one day so I could sort of check up on him and make sure he wasn't about to do something too nuts. There were no rants, no threatening statuses, just a long series of photo posts that made me think that he'd taken up photography or something. I'm scrolling through them when I started to get this familiar feeling from looking at the scenery. I couldn't be 100% sure, but I'd swear a lot of the pictures he'd taken were of things that were around the town I was living in. There were no street signs or anything, nothing that actually confirmed he'd actually driven across the country, but if he wasn't taking pictures in a town that looked remarkably similar to mine, then I could have been in a whole lot of trouble. I expected that guy to jump me for weeks after, like I was a complete nervous wreck. It messed with my sleep. I lost a bunch of weight, being in an almost constant state of anxiety for the better part of a month. He didn't find me. Nothing happened as a result, thank God. But just knowing he could pretty much come and get me anytime he liked got to me in ways I never even imagined it ever could. We put ourselves on Front Street in a big way with social media, and it could literally be anyone out there just lurking on our profiles. So like I said, now I'm kind of weird and cautious about social media. I don't put too much out there, and I don't use any real name. I run the strictest privacy settings possible, and I really recommend you do too. I live here in a place called Mountain City down here in Tennessee. So this is going back about 10 years after I graduated high school when this really messed up story started going around about one of the other kids that I graduated with. It starts in the worst possible way too, because first I heard of it was a buddy of mine texting me saying, "Did you hear about Billy Payne?" I text back saying no, and he then calls me all serious sounding to say that Billy and his baby mom got shot just a few days before. Like someone rolled up to their house, bust open the door and just shot them both right there in front of the television. They were legit executed. Some of the papers said it was a single shot to the head that killed both victims and how Billy's throat had been slashed. We got to wondering why someone might do something like that. If it was a random psycho killer or if he was moving weight and managed to step on someone's toes. I did remember hearing about Billy messing around with drugs a few times, so it wasn't totally out of the question, but he must have done something serious to have whoever it was shoot his baby mama right there too. Like that's real cold-blooded, you know? But even saying that, he just didn't seem like the kind of guy to get involved with serious gangbangers. Anyway, the cops catch the two guys who committed the murder. One of them is this Vietnam vet who said in court that he was ex-CIA too. Anyway, they get charged, go up in front of a judge, and you know why they said they did it? Because the CIA had told them that the two murder victims were part of some evil group that was planning on killing their daughter. But in reality, Billy Payne and his baby mom were shot dead because they unfriended one of the killer's daughters on Facebook. Can you actually believe that? That someone would take social media that seriously and actually kill somebody because of a friend request? I mean, I didn't. I was convinced that there was more to it than that, and as much as it made me feel like a gorehound, I stayed interested in the trial to find out why they'd done something so horrendous. Like the cops found Billy's baby alive in his mom's arms. Poor kid is going to grow up without a mother and a father. But then yeah, that's the only reason or motive established, and the prosecutor brings up Facebook messages detailing intense arguments between Billy, his girlfriend, and the girl who got unfriended. They'd argue about it back and forth for hours with some pretty harsh language exchanged too, and then the girl says that she's going to tell her dad. I don't know if the girl just didn't expect her dad to actually go kill them or that she knew he'd overreact. But if it's the latter, then she has blood on her hands too, as far as I'm concerned. Like it's the way she told her dad too. She just didn't tell him direct. She invented some fake CIA agent that got in touch with her dad over Facebook to tell them all this messed up stuff about how their daughter was in grave danger. I suppose it just scares me that people could take something like Facebook that seriously, but it's obvious that some people out there put so much belief in social media that they're willing to kill over perceived insults or whatever. And that's why I keep my social media presence pretty small these days. Aside from all the ratchety drama that goes on in our timelines every so often, it's just not a healthy place for some people, and it kind of blows my mind that Facebook could be the reason that anyone got shot. On the morning of April 12, 2018, 27-year-old Renita Williams of Shreveport, Louisiana was at home minding her own business. She lived at home with her mother, Anita, and had just broken up with her long-term boyfriend, Jonathan Robinson. Like many relationships, the breakup had been a messy one, and a great deal of drama had unfolded on social media websites, mainly the most popular of them, Facebook. Apparently, Jonathan had moved on rather quickly from Renita and had recently started dating a woman from Houston, Texas named Sharika Taylor. And although it's not entirely clear what the ins and outs of the social media drama were, there had definitely been some exchange between the two women that had seriously enraged Jonathan Robinson. As foolish as it often is, men sometimes attempt to defend the honor of the women in their lives, but no one could have expected Jonathan to take such extreme measures in what amounted to little more than an exchange of harsh words. Because before Jonathan pulled up to Renita's place on the morning of April 12th, he had just driven by his aunt's house to retrieve something he'd previously hidden in the basement of her home, a high-caliber, semi-automatic rifle. He was so delirious with anger that he didn't even bother to turn off the engine of the vehicle he'd driven up in. He simply grabbed the rifle from the passenger seat, kicked in the dead-bolted front door to the house, and then started shooting. It seems those first few shots were merely to terrify those in the home, because no one was actually hurt during the first few minutes of the attack. Whilst her mother and younger brother escaped from the rear of the home, Jonathan quickly located a terrified Renita, who believed she was about to be immediately executed, but apparently her ex-boyfriend had other plans for her first. Keeping her at gunpoint, he told her to grab her cell phone and begin a Facebook Live broadcast. At first, Renita had no idea why she would need to do something like that, but all slowly became clear when Jonathan began to demand she apologize to Taylor, his new girlfriend. In a terrifying public display of humiliation, Jonathan could be seen pointing the barrel of his rifle at the mother of three's head while he made her apologize over and over again for the perceived offense. She was terrified, voice quivering as she complied. Meanwhile, Renita's mother was hiding in the backyard, having had the foresight to grab her cell phone before fleeing from the gunshots. With shaking hands, she hammered 911 onto her phone's touchscreen, then begged the dispatcher to send help in a hushed but terrified tone. Yet the police were far closer than she could have imagined, because Officer Brittany Mackey was actually within earshot of the gunfire. As soon as she heard the shots, she rolled up to St. Vincent Avenue at Natalie Street and got out of her vehicle with her pistol drawn. Jonathan Robinson looked up to see the cops arrive mere minutes after he'd burst into the home, and he was seething with rage. He immediately executed Renita as she kneeled on the floor below him, then walked out of the busted front door and began shooting at Officer Mackey. Using trees and parked vehicles as cover, Jonathan sent round after round of high-caliber rifle fire into the officer's patrol car, forcing her into cover. Mackey immediately got onto her radio and began calling in backup, with her colleagues actually hearing the sound of gunfire over the airwaves. She then got as low behind the back wheel of her patrol car as she possibly could, and prayed for swift reinforcements. Just 2 minutes later, that backup arrived in the form of Corporals Joshua Pettigrew and Greg Walker. They screeched up the street, coming to a stop just short of Officer Mackey's patrol car. The officers then jumped out of the vehicle, took cover behind the open doors, and sent a torrent of .45 caliber pistol bullets at Jonathan's firing position. The overwhelming firepower pushed him back into the house, and the two corporals lost track of their target. The next two cops on the scene were two special response team members, Corporals Landry Ducto and Michael Gerbine. The pair took off running for the other side of the street, but Jonathan opened fire once again, this time from a vantage point on the second floor of the house he was occupying. The air around them cracked and whizzed with .7.62 bullets, ricocheting off the concrete as they narrowly missed their targets, but luckily, neither officer was wounded. He's in a sniper position, another officer can be heard screaming on a police cruiser's dash cam. Get down! Robinson had the supreme advantage of a concealed elevated position coupled with high-caliber weaponry, and for almost an hour, he kept every officer pinned down and unable to approach his position. They were so heavily outgunned that the only two shots that managed to fire were to disable the car Robinson left running in the driveway when he barged into the Williams home. Plus, the police had no idea where he was even shooting from and couldn't risk civilian casualties by peppering the entire home with bullets. To the officers pinned down at the scene, waiting for a full special response team to arrive seemed like an eternity. Eventually, a full police SWAT team was pushing up towards the house, preparing to breach and clear the entire structure to locate and eliminate the active shooter. Yet just as the team was cleared to breach, Jonathan indicates to those on scene that he wished to surrender. They hesitated and fell right into his trap. He opened fire on them first and sent a bullet smashing through SRT operative Robert Entrikin's right wrist. "I've been hit," Entrikin cried over his radio. "Officer hit." Another torrent of bullets are exchanged for a few moments before a sudden lull in the volume of fire. Then, to the surprise of the attending officers, Jonathan appeared to walk out of the busted front door again. Only this time, he was unarmed, and he proceeded to lie down on the front lawn of the house in a show of surrender. The SR team rushed in, putting cuffs on the shooter before dragging him away. Renita's mother and brother are led away from the scene safely, but heartbreakingly, Renita had succumbed to her wounds before the EMTs could get to her. At his murder trial, Jonathan Robinson pled guilty to first-degree murder and admitted to investigators that he fired on police officers because he wanted to die. He narrowly escaped the death penalty by agreeing to a plea deal presented to him by prosecutors and was later sentenced to life in prison. 100 years ago, a person would have to drag another into a busy street to perform a public execution. But nowadays, all it takes is a few button clicks on a cell phone to have all your family and friends watching as you're executed in cold blood by some deranged killer. And such incidents can happen so fast that there's simply no way of preemptively or actively censoring them, no matter how hard Facebook might try. As long as there's a technology available that allows us to share all the intimate details of our lives, humanity seems to relish in sharing not just the good and positive, but also the darker, more terrifying things too. Stephen Nicholson's arrest as the main suspect in a violent, indecent assault and murder sparked off one of the UK's biggest evidence searches, which involved a trawl of thousands of hours of CCTV footage. He was the prime suspect in the murder of Lucy McHugh, and actually rented a room in her parents' home at the time of her murder. At one point, it looked like the British police might actually have to let him go due to lack of evidence, but in the end, it was a Facebook password that proved to be his ultimate undoing. After he was arrested, the police had just 96 hours to charge him with the murder, or he would have to be released. And given that it would take 4 weeks to get a key piece of DNA evidence analyzed and sent back to them, the clock was ticking to find something concrete that they could use to charge him with murder. The police subjected Stephen to vigorous questioning and managed to get him to admit that Lucy had sent him a Facebook message on the night before she was killed. When pressed as to what that message said, he said she told him she was pregnant with his child. He intended this to be evidence that it couldn't possibly have been him that killed her, but when police asked him to hand over his Facebook password so that they could verify his claims, he refused to give it to them. This was his one big mistake. When asked why he refused to share the password with them, Stephen told officers that he was involved quite heavily with some narcotics dealers around his hometown, and that revealing his messages would compromise them, possibly even causing them to take reprisals against him. But this didn't wash with investigating officers, who became convinced that the information contained within the account could be used against him. It also presented them with a marvelous opportunity. There were two options available to them, one being to seek the compliance of U.S. federal courts to get Facebook to hand over Stephen's passwords to them, but that would have taken way longer than just 96 hours, and by that time, Stephen would be freed. But the other was to make use of some terrorism legislation, what is known as Section 53 of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, colloquially called RIPA among police officers. This means that anyone who seeks to withhold information, such as computer passwords, during a serious crime investigation can basically be charged with obstruction of justice. Right when it looked like Stephen was going to be bailed, he was rearrested, and after pleading guilty to withholding evidence at Southampton Crown Court, he was jailed for 14 months. With that, the police managed to buy themselves more time to find evidence of his involvement in Lucy McHugh's murder. However, while there was plenty of circumstantial evidence that Stephen had killed Lucy, there was nothing to physically link the spot where Lucy's body was found in Nicholson. Whatever weapon he used to kill her remained unaccounted for, and police officers were unable to find any of his DNA at the scene. Once again, investigators were forced to focus on Stephen's so-called online footprint, this time seeking help from an experienced cloud data analyst to try to link Stephen to the scene of the crime. A cloud data analyst's job is to study various pieces of digital information sent from Nicholson's phone to data servers, which are owned by companies such as Google and Facebook. While tracing the phone's route on the day of Lucy's murder, the analyst happened to notice a small blip in an area of Southampton that the police had not yet searched. It suggested that Nicholson had, for whatever reason, deviated from his most direct route home. The diversion took him to a place known as Tanner's Brook, a stream which meanders through Southampton, weaving its way through some pretty dense woodland in the western portion of the city. Detective Superintendent Paul Barton later said to journalists, "With the help of the analyst, what we discovered was a slight deviation on his telephone, which didn't match the story he'd given us. You could say it had jumped a mast, so to speak, and therefore put Stephen at the place where we discovered some bloody, discarded clothing. It was a great bit of work from the analyst who pointed it out." The subtle shift in the narrative given by the killer was enough for police to launch one of the largest ever fingertip searches, which involved almost 200 officers from 12 other police forces. By that point, it had been 4 weeks since Lucy's dead body was found, but on the first day of the search, police got the exact kind of breakthrough that they had been hoping for. They found a discarded plastic bag containing a blue bloodstained hoodie, along with a number of other items that were described in court as Nicholson's murder kit. The blue hoodie contained Nicholson's DNA, as well as Lucy's blood, with Stephen being thought to have dumped the clothing, some of which had been partially burnt, near the brook after getting changed on his return from the murder scene on July 25th. Prior to the discovery of the clothing, police had no other direct evidence of Nichols' involvement in her killing. They attested fibers from every bloodstained jacket and Stephen's clothes, which suggested direct contact with the hoodie, but that simply wasn't enough to actually charge him with a crime. Homicide detectives had already established that hoodies of the same type were sold to 2 people in the Southampton area, and that one of them was given a present to a man who knew a friend of Stephen's. The DNA evidence was the final nail in the coffin for Nicholson, according to Detective Superintendent Barton. During the course of the investigation, police officers had studied 11,000 hours of CCTV footage, examined over 2,000 pieces of physical evidence, and taken more than 300 written reports. A Herculean amount of work had given them a strong circumstantial case, but in the end, genetic evidence was what the police really needed to prove that Stephen was Lucy's killer. But had Stephen not been jailed over refusing to hand over his Facebook password, the outcome could have been very, very different. The 14-month jail sentence not only bought the police a great deal of time, but it also potentially stopped Stephen from going back to Tanner's Brook to move the evidence he had dumped there. And it's frankly astounding that the killer of a child might well be walking the streets right now if it wasn't for something as simple as a Facebook password. Public prosecutors were eventually granted access to Stephen's Facebook account on the first day of his murder trial, but found that he had deleted most of his messages before he was arrested. As it turned out, it didn't matter in the least bit if Stephen gave them the password. He still wouldn't be able to be charged based on the absence of the messages. If he'd only gone and given police the password, he might still be free to walk the streets. One of the prosecutors, a Mr. Montague, criticized the protracted process, saying that for him, the personal side, the human side, is we have a 13-year-old child that has been murdered under ferocious circumstances. And for me, it's somewhat frustrating that Facebook seems so unwilling to help with our investigation by recovering deleted messages. Facebook said it had worked closely with the investigating officers, but that they agree that this legal process can be far too slow. We have actually lobbied for reforms to EU, US, and UK laws to allow us and others to directly and more quickly provide information to UK law enforcement authorities, a spokeswoman for the company said. But despite the slow process, police have been able to build a case against an extremely narcissistic, self-centered, violent predator who had torn apart a family kind enough to put a roof over his head when they could have easily turned him away. He preyed on their underage daughter, and when it looked like she might actually tell on him, he killed her. But at no point could he have expected that something as seemingly insignificant as his Facebook password would actually be the thing to put him behind bars.
I was on Snapchat for like 20 seconds when all of my friends had already reposted these really weird messages saying that a senior had then threatened to shoot up the school. The message by the guy had said,
Mothers will mourn, siblings will cry, fathers will remember. I'm going to kill someone this week. God help me.
Then there was a video of him shooting an AR-15. I was understandably totally creeped out. I started calling my mom and dad, crying and begging for them not to make me go to school. Luckily, they said they heard about it and that me and my sister didn't have to go to school. There were about 3 kids that ended up being arrested for the plot of the threat, and nothing actually happened that day. I don't know what happened to the guy who said that, but all I know is that I hope he got the help that he needs. It's really crazy to think about what could have happened if he would have succeeded. I've been trying to have more of a social life. I spend most of my days off from work at home and in bed. It's gotten so bad that whenever I attempt to go out, I immediately get overwhelmed and I always have to leave. I've even downloaded a few apps that are strictly for platonic relationships, and because of this interaction, I'll definitely be uninstalling them. It doesn't really take much for me to be friends with someone. I guess I'm really naive and look past any possible red flags if there are any. I met someone that I used to work with in the same building, and we both thought, wow, who would have guessed that we'd cross paths? Then boom, instantly became friends. Let's call him Josh. Josh told me I was pretty during a couple of times during our first interaction, but I brushed it off and I told him that I only wanted a friend, and he seemed to be okay with that. One thing that really stood out to me was how easy it was to talk to him. We talked every day constantly for about a week via Snapchat, and I really enjoyed our conversations. It was enough for me to want to hang out with them. Last night I got out of work a little earlier than expected, so I thought that I'd go to a bar since it was still happy hour. I had a good day and I really wanted a beer. One beer turned into like 8, and the drunken, outgoing, not so socially awkward me came out to play. I pulled out my phone and then started looking through my contact list for anyone to invite. I messaged Josh and sure enough, he was down. He requested an Uber and within about 10 minutes, he showed up. The initial meeting was pretty fine. The alcohol flowing through me made it really easy. He wasn't really interested in doing any drinking, so I closed my tab and I had a really brilliant plan. Let's freaking go to Walmart, I exclaimed. I don't really know why I wanted to go to Walmart, I just wanted to do something.
Josh happily agreed though, so we walked to Walmart. When we got there, Josh had told me that he had to use the bathroom, so while he did that, I walked around the store waiting for him. A lot of time passed, so I decided to message him and ask what's up. Josh then replied with,
I went to the bathroom to jerk off.
When I asked him why he told me that and why he told me he had a boner, it was really awkward and he said that he was trying to get rid of it. I don't really know what exactly was going through my head at the time, but I remember muttering, "What the hell?" to myself over and over again. Shortly after, he messaged me a bunch asking me to help him, saying that it was because of me, telling me just how much that he really wanted to screw me and how he was really close to coming out of the bathroom and kissing me. Just really gross stuff. I started hyperventilating. My heart literally felt like it was going to jump right out of my chest. My flight or fight mode then kicked in and I just started running out of that Walmart. I ran back to the bar I was at and got another beer. I also told the bartender everything that happened just in case he decided to come back. Then I requested an Uber to go home. I'm sober now and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. I actually decided to go back and read our messages and I was way too freaking nice about it. I just kept saying to him that it's okay, I'm just a bit uncomfortable, and also apologizing afterwards. I decided to text Josh about an hour ago. I wanted to let him know that his behavior was not okay, and that I screenshot the messages. He apparently shops pretty frequently at the store that I work at, so I know that I'll eventually have to face him again, and it really sends shivers down my spine. Just great. When I was 13 years old, my mom had a breakdown and she couldn't work for over a year. This caused us some economic issues and we lost a lot of things in our house. Our car was the main problem. It broke down and my mom didn't have enough money to get someone to fix it, so all she could really do was get rid of it. Without a car, we all started taking the bus and train pretty much everywhere. Me and my brother took the bus to school, and our school was actually kind enough to get us taxis to drive us home. One day, about 2 or 3 years after my mom's breakdown, I was waiting outside for my taxi to come. The taxi usually comes out about 15 minutes after I end the last lesson, but on that day in particular, it was about 50 minutes late. Then when it finally came, I jumped inside and he drove off. I was a little sour that I had to wait almost an hour, but I didn't really complain since I was really just happy to finally be on my way home. Now, since I took the taxi home pretty much every single day of school, I had started recognizing the drivers. The driver on that day was pretty new. I had never seen him before. He had a full beard and an AC/DC cap on. The first thing he did after he drove off was apologizing for being so late. I told him it was okay and he started up a conversation. He asked me if I wanted him to put on some music, and I said sure. I discovered quite quickly that he actually had the same taste of music as me, so I felt right at home. No real worries at all yet. About a week or so later, I was waiting outside for the taxi. I realized the taxi was then late yet again, and a thought came to my mind that maybe it was that driver. He had become my favorite driver since he had been so friendly and really talkative. But I hadn't really seen him since that one time. And just as quick as that thought came to my mind, the taxi arrived, and surprise, surprise, it was him. I decided to sit at the front this time for some reason, and we started up a new conversation. I remember his phone's notification tone. I thought it was funny, so I laughed a little, and that started up a new conversation about how he found himself to be funnier than most guys out there. He asked me if I agreed, and that's when all of the red flags started going off. However, I decided to shake it off. Everyone says weird things sometimes. It's okay, right? After a bit of talking, he then asked me about my age. Really just viewing it as an innocent question, I then answered him that I had just turned 15. He pulled out a piece of paper as well as a pen, and then he asked me a question.
Do you have Snapchat?
I kind of got silent for a while. The alarm bells were wailing like crazy, and I just knew this was wrong. He was like 30 years old and I was 15, and he was my taxi driver.
Why would I want to talk to my taxi driver on my spare time? I was so scared to turn him down though. I really didn't know what he would do if I turned him down. It's not like he was forcing it on me or that he was trying to be intimidating, but I just didn't trust that it would turn out alright if I turned him down. So I said yes, and then I wrote my username on the paper. When I finally came home that afternoon, I felt really guilty about it. It just didn't feel right. I got into the house, got into my room, then sat down on my bed with my phone right in front of me and just stared at it. I was really terrified that he was going to add me and then start talking, but also that I had misspelt my username and that he would probably question me about it the next time he picked me up. And then after about 10 minutes, I got a notification. He added me. He had sent me a hey. I tried pulling myself together and then started chatting with him. Now at first, it was pretty innocent. Then of course, it started getting weird. For everything I said, he would come up with a way to compliment me or try and be flirty. Example, "So where do you live?" I asked. Since he knew where I lived, I thought it wouldn't really be a big deal to ask where he lived.
I live in a small town right outside of yours. Why? Do you want to come visit sometime?
He said. What do you do in your spare time?
I like to go fishing. It's a guilty pleasure of mine.
Oh wow, I've always wanted to try that out.
Maybe we can do it together sometime.
And then came the creepiest question. I had started catching on what he was after, so I then started to question him about it. Why did you even add me?
What? I thought you liked older men.
Yeah, it was creepy, and no, I didn't like older men. He had apparently thought that since I liked having a conversation with him, that I liked him or something. So the very next day afterwards, I was absolutely terrified that he was gonna pick me up. I thought about blocking him or telling him to stop talking to me, but I was only a 15-year-old girl and he was a big 30-year-old grown man. What if he got mad at me? God knows what he would do to me the next time he picked me up if he was in a sour mood. To my absolute relief, the taxi that picked me up that day was a different driver, and as quick as I got inside, I told him what happened. I had asked him to tell his boss or whatever to maybe reassign him so that I wouldn't have to see him, but luckily the boss was a lot smarter than that. The next day afterwards, the driver had told me that the man was fired and he was never going to drive another taxi for the rest of his life. I really hope that's true. Apparently he had been preying on a lot of other young girls too, but none of them had spoken out about it. I blocked him on Snapchat, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. Thank the Lord.
A couple years ago, when I was 15, I was really big into Snapchat. I was kind of obsessed with building my Snap score, so I would add random friends and accept random requests to do so. It was pretty weird, I know, but being that young, my Snap score was a number that mattered to me for whatever reason. Now, a lot of my friends from school and I have this group chat. I remember it was a Saturday when one of them mentioned we should go to the mall. A lot of them agreed, and I wanted to as well, but realized I didn't have a ride. So I posted it on my story if anyone was able to pick me up and take me. I was more so expecting someone I knew to respond, like my cousin or something. But I got a Snapchat back from this guy I'd never talked to before. Or at least his Bitmoji was a guy. But either way, I didn't know who it was. It said he was my friend on Snapchat, but we had never had a single conversation or even shared any pictures back and forth before. He texted me something about how he was bored and had nothing better to do. I remember responding to him, asking if he even lived in the same state. It turns out he did, but the town he said he lived in was at least a 2-hour drive from me. I told him not to worry about it, and I didn't want him to drive 2 hours just to take me to the mall. But he quickly responded saying why not. At this point, the whole conversation felt off to me, but he insisted. I finally ended up agreeing. I told him he could come pick me up, but only if he was willing to send me a picture of himself. I was just trying to be cautious. A couple minutes later, he sent me a snap. I opened it, just to see some 30-year-old guy looking back at me. The guy had on a really dirty hat, smiling at the camera, though like half of his teeth were missing. The caption on the snap said he was on his way. I sat there for a second thinking it over in my head. How did the guy know where to pick me up? He didn't even ask for my address. That's when my heart dropped, realizing I had my Snap Map on, meaning that anyone I had as a friend on the app could easily find my address. I panicked and quickly responded to the guy apologizing, saying I actually had a closer friend willing to take me. Now, obviously that wasn't true, but the fact that this guy was willing to drive 2 hours to pick someone up he had never even met before, just from their location on the Snap Map alone, gave me an off vibe. Plus, the guy looked insanely creepy. Definitely not someone I'd feel comfortable being around. The guy opened the Snap a couple minutes later, but never responded. As far as I know, he never showed up. Though, I live in a cul-de-sac, and usually we wouldn't get any cars passing by our house. But I swear, for at least the next few days, there was this same black SUV that would constantly drive by. Whether that was related or not, I don't know. Though, about a month later, I was on Facebook scrolling through my feed. I passed a news story that had one of those attachments, meaning it was sourced on a different website. I almost always scroll past those things, but I couldn't help but stop for this one. There, on my Facebook feed, I could clearly see a picture of that guy from Snapchat. There was no doubt in my mind it was the same guy. The headline of the news story read that he was arrested for attempted murder. This whole experience makes me think I dodged a major bullet by trusting my gut and not accepting a ride from the guy. The whole situation shook me up for a while, and nowadays I try to be a lot smarter and only allow people I trust to see me on the Snap Map. I'm a female, and when I was a sophomore in high school, I took a lot of different classes. One of them I don't think I'll ever forget. It was a history class, and the regular teacher for the class had another job on top of teaching. And because of this, we would often get a substitute teacher for the class. It was always the same guy. I would say he was at least in his mid-50s. Nothing ever struck me as odd about him, since if I'm being honest, I rarely even ever paid attention in that class. That was until one day. I was in the middle of working on a project he assigned, but every time I looked up from my paper, he was just staring at me. Every time I would look at him, he wouldn't even break eye contact and try to play it off either. One of the times I looked up, I noticed he had his phone pointed in my direction. It looked like he was taking pictures of me. I of course was creeped out, but didn't say anything in case I was wrong. Anyway, a few weeks later, somehow, which I still don't know how to this day, the guy found my Snapchat username and added me. I knew it was him too, as he had his full name on the account. I didn't know what to do, but I still regret the decision I made. Knowing he had an influence on my grade, I ended up adding him back. A few minutes later, he sent me a snap saying hey. He had his face in it and everything. At this point, I knew something wasn't right. I took a screenshot of the snap and left him on red. He quickly followed up with another snap, this time a black screen with a question mark as the caption. I again left him on red and forgot about the whole situation. Over the next few weeks, there were multiple occasions where I would check the Snap Map just to see him not far away. And this would happen anywhere too, not just at school. I would be at the mall with my friends, for example, and see he just so happened to be at the same mall. Or even sometimes at school, when I knew for a fact he didn't work that day. Though, overall, for a solid month, nothing but those supposed coincidences took place regarding the whole situation. But of course, a few days later, I would get a random message from him. I could tell it was a chat this time, and not a regular snap. I opened it, and I was absolutely horrified. He sent around 50 pictures of me in pretty much any situation. Some were of me at school, but others, confirming my suspicion about him following me on the Snap Map, were of me not on school campus. Obviously, I left him on red, screenshotted everything, and blocked him. I instantly told my parents, and they notified both the school and the police. It's been 2 years since the situation. I'm a senior now, and ever since he sent the pictures, I'd never seen him again. I can only assume he was fired, as we actually got another substitute teacher who was really nice. Overall, the whole situation was really disturbing. The fact that I had someone following me around and taking pictures of me just based on my location on the Snap Map for a good month of my life absolutely terrifies me. I deleted Snapchat shortly after the whole experience, and like I said, I haven't seen the guy since, so I'm not entirely sure whatever ended up happening to him.
This happened about 2 or 3 years ago when I was still a minor and in high school. I was walking home alone and I think it was starting to get close to daylight savings. It was around 5 p.m. and it was starting to get dark. I was making my way past downtown since I live nearby. My high school is in the dead center of downtown, so most people have to either drive or walk through it to get back to the neighborhoods. So as I was walking back, I was minding my own business and started listening to a podcast. I think that I might have been crossing a street or a stoplight when I then laughed at whatever I was listening to, and this weird guy then kind of shoots me a weird look. I ignored it and just kept walking down the street, assuming that he wasn't going to bother me since he seemed to be going in a different direction than me. I was about 2 blocks down when I see the same guy now jogging up to me, and I was really put off by him since he was some older guy, maybe in his 30s.
Hey girl, I just ran a mile to come talk to you.
I kind of just rolled my eyes at him and then said, "You ran like 2 blocks.
I guess I was just exaggerating. Anyways, I just wanted to tell you that you're the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. How old are you?"
I'm a minor. Well, this didn't stop him.
Oh, so you're younger. I really dig that in a relationship.
At this point, I really wanted to tell him to screw off, but there was nobody around since I was on the edges of downtown and it was starting to turn into apartments. I just asked him what he wanted so that I could leave, and he asked me for my number. I felt like it was the safest option to give him what he wanted, but instead I punched in my Snapchat. He let me leave after this, and we both went on our ways. At this point, I thought that he would maybe only shoot me about 2 or 3 messages and then give up. Not even 2 hours later, this dude actually messages me about 3 times asking to take me out to a bar and drink, and I then felt disgust boil up inside of me. I reminded him that I'm a minor and that I couldn't really do that. He continued to say some pretty nasty things to me, telling me I was hot and how he wanted to mess around with me. I was starting to get really pissed off, but instead of blocking his number, I really wanted to give him a piece of my mind. So I told him he was gross and that he shouldn't even be talking to me since I was a minor, and the fact that he was preying on younger girls was really nasty. Then he said,
"Oh damn, I really love that you're so fiery and sassy. I hope our babies are just like that in the future. You're gonna be a really great mother to my kids. Let me pick you up from your high school so we can mess around."
My skin ran cold at this remark, and I instantly blocked his Snapchat. I never actually told him that I was even in high school or what high school I was going to. For a while, I always made sure not to walk that same way home, and I always watched out for him, but I never saw his car again. Thankfully, he left me alone. I'm guessing to go prey on some other young girls. I really just want to warn other young girls of this predatory behavior, and if you think you're in danger or that someone might come onto you, always make sure you have some form of self-defense. If there's no way out of the situation, try to resolve the issue and get out of there as quickly as possible. Before anyone asks me why I have a stranger on my Snapchat in the first place, I'm going to clarify that whenever people add me, whether it's for my Instagram or just quick add, I always add them back. However, I don't remember adding this guy back. So basically, this started yesterday when me and my cousin just got home from a party around 10 p.m. We were sitting in my living room for a while, just watching Netflix, and nothing seemed really weird during that time. At one point, I jokingly said to my cousin, "Look behind you," because we really like to mess with each other like that. However, this time she was pretty sure that she actually saw something in the window actually move behind her. Not really thinking anything of it, I just figured she was trying to scare me back, and pretty much just forgot about it. That was until out of nowhere, my dog jumped up, ran to the front door, and then started barking really aggressively. We kept trying to yell at her, trying to get her to stop, but she didn't leave it alone for at least another 3 minutes. I thought that maybe she could have just heard a noise from the TV or something that scared her. But the movie we were watching had ended like 30 minutes ago, and we were both just sitting in silence on our phones. Keep in mind, all of this happened around 12 a.m. After this happened, I was kind of nervous and pretty confused, but my dog had done this a few times before, So once again, I just tried to ignore it and not really think too much about it. It was now around 1 a.m. when me and my cousin decided to go upstairs and start getting ready for bed. I was laying down and on my phone checking out Snapchat when I decided to open Snap Maps. Then I saw it. Someone was at my house with me. I started thinking of all of the different possibilities of who would be that close to me. This guy's name was Sebastian. At this point, I was really confused and starting to get worried because I don't even know a Sebastian. And like I stated at the very beginning of this story, I don't ever even remember adding back a Sebastian. I decided to go back downstairs to check and make sure that all of the doors were locked. In my house, we have an alarm system where every time you open a door, it will chime to let you know. For some reason though, it was unplugged, meaning if any of the doors were being opened, whether it would be the shed door, backyard gate, or just any other door leading to my house, no one in our house would be notified. I had asked my cousin if she was the one that unplugged it, and she didn't even know we had it. I was genuinely worried now, because when I checked the Snap Map, it said that he was last seen an hour ago. And that very same hour ago was the same exact time when my dog started viciously barking at the front door, for no reason. The more that I thought about everything, the more that it seemed connected, but there was really nothing I could do, as I had already checked downstairs and already locked all of the doors. I actually do have multiple cameras around my house, and I decided I would just check them in the morning because I needed to get the password from my mom anyway. It's currently the afternoon now, and I'm still waiting to check the cameras, but nothing really weird has happened since last night. Although when I last checked Snap Maps, it said that he was last seen 11 minutes ago and still at my house. I did send him a chat and then said, "Who are you?" And he just replied back with,
Who am I? Who are you?
so I didn't answer. His Snapchat score is 28,000, so it isn't really likely that this is a fake account. I won't know anything else until I check the cameras, but if I do find anything, I'll definitely insert pictures and screenshots of the chat and Snap Map if necessary. I'm not really sure what to do because I don't really have any proof that I could bring to the cops. It just really seems like everything is just some weird coincidence, and I'm really creeped out at being at my house now. But like I said, I'll let you know if I find anything. Alright guys, so I have an update. Okay, so today has literally been crazy. Me and my cousin both have been really freaked out. I'll start with last night. Me and my cousin had been hearing some really strange things all night long. I even thought that I heard people talking outside my house around 2 a.m. Also, for everyone that keeps telling me to call the police, we actually did that today. But the reason we didn't do it last night or the night before is because at the time, we thought that we were just being paranoid. That is, until now. Sebastian wasn't on the Snap Map at all last night, so we both figured that he wouldn't be anywhere near us, and like I said, we were just getting paranoid. However, we were really wrong. We finally got the password to check the cameras, and fortunately, we didn't really find anything from the night before. Then we checked the footage that was from last night around 2 a.m. The camera picked up a figure, and I have multiple pictures you guys can look at. The figure looks white, but I think it was actually all black and the camera inverted it, but I don't really know. Here's some of the photos and screenshots of when I first noticed that he was on the map. Anyway, for those of you who kept telling us to call the police, we did. They came this morning and they checked the footage. They also looked around our house just to make sure that nobody was still lurking around. They said that they would patrol around our neighborhood when it got dark for the next few nights. They made a report on the man trespassing and we gave them as much information as we could, and hopefully they can find him. We both feel a little bit better now, but it's really unnerving to know that somebody was actually lurking around our house last night. Neither one of us can figure out what he was doing or trying to do. He looked like he was just walking around, but like I said, we really have no clue what he wanted. Anyway, sorry for not updating sooner, but I couldn't get into the camera footage sooner, and I was really just worried and didn't really want to think too much about it. Also, I've been trying to answer your questions. So to all of you that keep telling me to turn off my Snapchat map of myself, well, it was never on. I have no idea how he got my address in the first place, or even if he knew it was my house.
and I definitely don't know anyone named Sebastian. This entire ordeal has been very stressful and scary for me, my cousin, and the rest of my family. I'm still very shaken up and really worried that he may return with worse intentions, but I really hope that doesn't happen. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Just after noon on Thursday, May 14th of 2020, the 72-year-old Long Island man, Dwight Powers, was participating in a Zoom call with around 20 other people. They were all part of the local chapter of Alcoholics Anonymous and, like millions of other people during the pandemic, were attempting an old system around new and frightening conditions. It wasn't like Dwight to miss a meeting. His long-held sobriety was precious to him, and his own slight technophobia wasn't going to stand in the way of that. Dwight sat at his computer in the small office he put together at his home on Dixon Avenue in Amityville, and warmly chatted with those in attendance before they noticed something moving in the background of Dwight's video feed. To their horror, they saw a figure walk into the room, slowly approaching Dwight from behind. Given that he was concentrating on the conversation unfolding on screen, Dwight was completely unaware that anyone was creeping up on him, and the first he knew of the intruder's presence was when they began viciously beating him about the face and neck. Other users in the call gasped as they saw such a cruel display of violence unfold before their very eyes, inflicted by a man who turned out to be completely naked. When the figure finished hitting Dwight and turned to leave the room, other callers asked if he was okay, but Dwight could barely respond. He was bleeding from a busted lip, and the sheer speed and intensity of the ambush had clearly shaken him. But to his viewers' horror, the attack wasn't over. The figure returned to the room holding something in each of his hands, things that glinted in the light of an overhead lamp, and in full view of almost 20 other Zoom callers, began stabbing Dwight in the back and side, over and over and over again. Those watching could do nothing but call 911 as they watched Dwight gargle blood before falling off of his chair. But even this was a fruitless task, since no one actually knew Dwight's home address. When Dwight fell, his attacker went down with him, plunging the large kitchen knives into Dwight's fallen body in a frenzied and bloody assault, until all people could hear over his computer's microphone were his dying breaths. The callers managed to give a vividly detailed description of Dwight's attacker, thanks to the quality of his computer webcam. But when the police honed in on a man fitting that description, who also happened to have Dwight's blood all over his change of clothes, they discovered something horrifying. That Dwight Powers' murderer was none other than 32-year-old Thomas Scully Powers, Dwight's own son. In a statement given to homicide detectives shortly after his arrest, Thomas Scully Powers admitted stabbing his own father around 20 to 25 times. He told them he returned to the kitchen at one point to change knives because the smaller, cheaper blades kept bending whenever they struck bone, and to fully decapitate his own father in a horrendous, unprovoked attack. Thomas had to use a bread knife to saw through the dense bone and cartilage of his father's spine. Suffolk County District Attorney Tim Seeney said, "This is a shocking and disturbing case. By the defendant's own admission, he brutally stabbed his own father repeatedly until he was certain he was dead. The investigation into this horrific murder is still ongoing, but rest assured we will obtain justice for the victim." Shockingly, when Thomas Scully Powers was charged with murder and appeared before a judge via video link to enter a plea, he insisted he was not guilty by reason of insanity. However, a psychiatric exam showed Thomas to be quite lucid, and in light of this, the judge ordered that he be held at the Riverhead Correctional Facility without bail, and that a maximum sentence of 25 years to life should be handed down should Thomas be found guilty. In the run-up to the trial, Thomas's defense attorney insisted that he would be exploring Mr. Powers' mental health and capacity in relation to this incident. It seemed obvious that they would be playing the insanity card, as I'm sure neither they nor the general public could comprehend any sane reason why a man would just murder his own father out of the blue. The prosecution argued that Thomas had murdered his father when he was completely lucid, owing to the fact that he tried to flee the scene when the cops arrived. He knew what he had done was wrong, and had attempted to hide the evidence of his crime by mopping up the blood and disposing of a bloody bedsheet in a trash bag. On top of that, when the cops arrived at the assisted living facility that Dwight Powers called home, his son tried to escape arrest by jumping out of a second-floor window. Despite being injured in the fall, Thomas ran across a busy highway and into a corner store where he attempted to use Dr. Pepper, of all things, to wash the blood from his clothes. Obviously, he was quickly spotted by the store's owner, who called in the police officers that arrested Thomas shortly afterward. In a statement to local media outlets, Suffolk County Police Department said that although they had yet to determine a motive for the stabbing, they could safely rule out any tensions stemming from father and son being quarantined together. Prosecuting attorneys were also confounded by the killing, saying Thomas had mentioned during his police interview that his father had tried to slit his wrist with a knife, but they had a physical inspection that revealed what they characterized as only a slight mark on Thomas's wrist, and dismissed the claim of self-defense as a flimsy attempt to mask a markedly darker motive. Two neighbors of Dwight Powers, Steve and Mary Englert, said they have been close friends of his family for the majority of the 40 years they'd spent living side by side. They said he was very close to his family, but although he undoubtedly had a lot of love for Thomas, Dwight seldom talked about his wayward son. With a euphemism that seemed to hide something much more sinister, Mary Englert told reporters that Thomas had struggles and would move in with his father during tough stretches. Dwight never hesitated to take Thomas back in, with Steve and Mary testifying that Dwight was a very devoted father. When his sons needed him, he was there, Mary told reporters with a glint of melancholy in her eye. As it turned out, Mary actually grew up with Dwight in the small town of Levittown, New York State, and said that he had been absolutely horrified to hear of her beloved neighbor's untimely death. At first, she simply refused to believe it was true, insisting it must have been some terrible mix-up, although the Englerts had been unable to call over at Dwight's house due to the pandemic. They made a point of calling him on his cell phone to wish him a happy birthday, which had only been a few weeks prior. "How could we have known that was the last time we'd ever talked to him?" Mary said. "It just didn't seem real that he was gone. Dwight loved his family so much. They were everything to him. I just can't imagine why it all happened." By all accounts, Dwight Powers was a stand-up guy. He had served as a rifleman in the United States Marine Corps and had a tour of Vietnam under his belt. When Dwight left the Marines, he got himself a job as a customs agent, opting for a quiet life in the suburbs where he could keep his family safe and happy. Folks said there wasn't a darn chance he had skeletons in his closet. He was just too much of a goof. He was 50 years old when he joined a rock band that played charity shows for children's foundations. Then when he was 60, Dwight grew a passion for the environment and began volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. When he wasn't making the world a better place, he could often be found watching reruns of The Three Stooges, laughing his butt off at wholesome slapstick humor. There have been plenty of suggestions that Dwight wasn't the family man he made himself out to be, and that a dark and sordid history of patriarchal abuse led to Thomas lashing out in some kind of psychotic frenzy. But every attempt to paint Dwight as some kind of abusive, smiling sociopath has either been based on circumstantial evidence or downright lies. But the question remains, will we ever find concrete evidence or testimony of Dwight's secret abuses? Or was a good man just unlucky enough to have a son who was violently and criminally deranged? Maybe people just want to find a rational excuse as to why a young man would murder his own loving father while completely in the buff. Because there's nothing scarier than the idea that we live in a world where those we shower with love, support, and affection can just snap one day, leaving us choking in a pool of our own blood, with the digital audience just having watched us die. On the morning of August 12, 2020, the young daughter of 32-year-old Maribel Rosada Morales was logging onto her computer for her first day of Zoom classes. Her home state of Florida had been one of the hardest hit by the pandemic, and like many of her Warfield Elementary School classmates, the closure of her school meant she was forced to participate in one of the great educational experiments of our time, one in which millions of children all over the world would be educated remotely using a piece of conference call software called Zoom. This new ad hoc method proved to have its fair share of problems, and scores of teachers reported difficulties in remote education almost immediately. But the teacher that morning must have had no idea what kind of horror she was about to face, a horror she would be unable to hide from young, innocent eyes. Around 8 a.m., the 10-year-old student was taking part in a roll call with around 30 other children when her teacher began to hear something in the background of her audio. It sounded like voices, hushed but strained, and as the minutes passed, the voices coming from the feed of Maribel Morales' daughter grew louder and louder. It got to the point where a full-on argument seemed to be breaking out in the home, and by the time profanity began to be used, the teacher realized that some kind of potentially violent domestic altercation was on hand. Then, the teacher, along with 30 other young children, watched in horror as the young Morales' girl looked off camera, then quickly covered her ears with a terrified look on her face. A series of loud pops could be heard, sounding strange and tinny when picked up by the laptop's cheap microphone. Many of the children asked what they were, but their teacher knew, and she was quick to mute the girls' mics so they couldn't hear what came next. The last the teacher and class saw of Maribel Morales' daughter was just before her screen suddenly went black, as a bullet fired from a 9mm handgun smashed into the computer's motherboard. Police officers responding to the teacher's 911 call arrived at the Morales' residence just minutes later, but they were too late. Lying on the floor, surrounded by screaming, terrified children, Maribel Rosado Morales had been shot to death in front of 4 of her own kids and 2 young cousins by a man who had apparently fled the scene on a stolen bicycle. Just a few hours later, police received a phone call from a city bus driver saying he and his passengers had been taken hostage by a man armed with a pistol. The man had ordered the driver to take him to a destination off of the bus's route and was in the process of subduing and intimidating the bus's many passengers, thus giving him an opportunity to call. He didn't seem to have made any demands, but he was armed and extremely agitated. It was a painfully volatile situation, but by some insane stroke of luck, a police SWAT team happened to be on a training exercise in the general vicinity. Once the bus was cornered, they stormed the vehicle and subdued the hostage-taker without a shot being fired. As he was being cuffed, the hostage-taker made a shocking confession. He told the heavily armed policeman that his name was Donald Williams, and that he had shot and killed his ex-girlfriend just a few hours before. And as it turned out, his ex-girlfriend was none other than 32-year-old Maribel Rosado Morales. Donald was subsequently charged with first-degree murder as well as several other felony charges, including being a convicted felon in possession of a gun. The local sheriff's department said that he would also be charged with armed burglary and armed home invasion, and that there would obviously be additional penalties due to the presence of children during such a horrific killing. In the aftermath, the Florida Department of Children and Families was faced with the heartbreaking task of finding new homes for poor children who had been orphaned during the attack, who were all between the ages of 10 to 17. The shooting rocked the local community, especially given that some of their own children had witnessed a life being taken, all thanks to advances in communications technology. Warfield Elementary and the Martin County School District released a statement saying, "Our deepest sympathies and condolences go out to the victim's family, including children present in the home who were witnesses to this heartbreaking and senseless tragedy. We have our grief team deployed to assist students and staff who will undoubtedly feel the impact of this horrible incident. We stand ready to assist and offer support in any way we can." But no amount of grief counseling will really put a dent into the immense trauma suffered by so many children that morning, not to mention their teacher, who for a few grim moments must have thought that she'd witnessed the death of a child while on the job. And once again, Such an incident proves that as much as advancements in technology have the capacity to enrich our lives, allowing us to stay in touch with people we're otherwise unable to see, it also has the capacity to darken them, too. Remember when the quarantine first started, and everyone was using Zoom for everything from work meetings to virtual birthday parties? Let me tell you, a lot of people weren't using passwords on their rooms, and if they were, the number of times that it was a 123 or a password was astounding. Point being, I broke into a whole lot of Zoom calls last summer, mostly with hilarious results. I hacked my way into some regional management meeting and told the exec he was fired. I got into what I figured was a remote learning session for a middle school where I successfully pretended to be a kid for like 15 minutes. I also caught some grandpa waiting for a call from a relative and almost convinced the guy that I was his grandson. Guy had to squint at the screen before telling me to go F myself. Okay, it was super obnoxious of me and I know I'm a jerk for doing it. But does it warm the cockles of your heart to know that I got my comeuppance? That I got what I deserve for sticking my dumb head where it didn't belong? I bet you are, even if it's just a little. But let's just see if that changes by the end of this story. So right after I had gotten into some afternoon mother's meeting to give them all the sad little Life Jane speech from Come Dine With Me, I figured I'd peaked. There was nowhere to go, no more mountains to climb, so I gave Zoom sniping a rest for a bit until the cravings returned to me later that evening. The fun thing about Zoom sniping at night was that you occasionally found something a bit saucier than you would in the daytime. For example, I once got into a Zoom call between a few girls having a virtual sleepover in various states of undress. I'm not saying I stayed longer than a few seconds. I'm not that much of a perv, but you get my point. So I'm typing in random words in the search bar to bring up potential sniping targets. I accidentally hit a punctuation mark and happened across a room with a very distinctive name. Most are just called like Andy's Room or Queen's Park Regional Subway Managers Meeting, boring stuff like that. But this room didn't even have a name. It just had a series of punctuation that made up a kind of shape, like a kind of curve or wave shape. Usually I had a plan of what I was going to do before I got into a call, a goof or a bit that I had in mind. But that time I didn't. That time I just had this nagging curiosity to see what was going on in it. But you know what they say about curiosity, right? Instant regret. When I loaded into the call and saw what was happening on 2 of the 4 panels, I immediately exited the call. It was like a gut reaction, almost like a physical reaction to being burned by something. Like I legit shouted, "Whoa," and backed up from the keyboard before my hand jumped to the mouse. Then I just sat there kind of dumbstruck, just processing what I'd seen. I don't want to go into what it was. I don't think I have the words or the emotional capacity to go into detail regarding what I saw that night. But put it this way. Imagine the sweetest, most innocent-looking child you've ever seen. Now imagine the worst possible thing you could do to them. The worst thing you could ever possibly conceive of. Whatever it is, you'd rather see it happening to the kid than what I actually saw for real. It absolutely positively fried my brain for about 30 minutes, because that's about how long it took for me to realize I should have called the cops. As much as the concept filled me with dread, I actually set about trying to find the room again. I had to at least try to jot down some details, backgrounds, physical descriptions, anything that I'd be able to hand over to the police to aid them in arresting the scumbags responsible for what I can only describe as ritualistic abuse. I wasn't even sure which piece of punctuation I'd punched in erroneously, but you can bet I tried every single one in my attempt to find that godforsaken room again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find it. I wasn't even sure what I could do at that point. I didn't think I could just call the police and be like, "I saw some kid getting messed with online, but I have 0 details." But apparently that's exactly what you're supposed to do. From what I found out over the next few days, after talking to a few Greater Manchester police officers, just telling the police what platform you see something dodgy on can help them pin down the people perpetrating the abuse. I didn't mean for this to turn into some internet safety infomercial. There was just so much I didn't know about how the police track down and remove that kind of indecent online material. We hear about stuff like that, and it all seems too abstract, like it's happening someplace else far, far away. But seeing it online like that, hiding in plain sight, it made me realize how kids are suffering like that every single day, all over the world, and we're not doing nearly enough as a society to stop it. But anyway, the point is, just be careful when you're snooping around online. You might just bite off considerably more than you can chew. That, and if you do see something, always report it. It might seem pointless, but just know your actions bring us all one step closer to ridding the world of dangerous predators. It all started with a Zoom call. At least, I only became aware it was happening because of a Zoom call. For all I know, it could have been happening for much longer, but the day of the second post-lockdown work meeting was the first time I noticed it. We're in the middle of a pretty tedious brainstorming session with a few members of marketing when a coworker interrupts whoever's talking to address me by name. It actually made me jump at first. I was totally tuned out, so hearing my name brought me right back around again. I respond, "Huh? Yep, I was listening." When I notice the person who addressed me is now closely studying their own laptop screen. "I don't mean to alarm you," they said, "but I think someone's watching you through the window behind you." I know exactly which window he's talking about, so I turn, a bit nervous at the idea of discovering he's right, only to see that there's no one there. I'm more relieved than anything, to be honest. I figured he was playing a joke on me because he clocked that I was nodding off during the meeting, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't maybe deserve it a little bit. "Very funny," I said, and a few of the other callers had a little titter at the impromptu prank. "I'm sorry, but I wasn't joking," the guy said. "Did no one else see that? I'm so sure." You're probably just seeing things," someone else chimed in, and within a few minutes, the whole thing was completely forgotten. A smudge on the screen, a bit of lag on the call, eyes playing tricks. There were 100 ways to explain it. The truth was literally unthinkable at that stage. A short while later, the exact same thing happens. The same guy interrupts, only far more urgently this time, saying, Look, it's right there. I'm not imagining it. You can all see that, yeah?" I know what he's talking about, only I don't turn around immediately. I look at my own webcam feed to see what he was talking about, and right when I see it, what's clearly the silhouette of a head in the window behind me, I hear one of the other callers say "Oh, wow, I see it too." I spin around just in time to catch the quick blur of whoever was watching me, ducking out of view. I'm actually really creeped out at this point because it obviously wasn't just somebody walking past my ground floor bedroom. Someone had actually stopped to stare inside. My window isn't even facing the street. It's at the side of the apartment block, like you have to actually go out of your way to find it. Now, I'm only 5'3" and I'm 8 stone, which for any Americans reading this means I'm tiny. And I had to make sure if someone was actually creeping on me, they weren't just hiding out and waiting until I was vulnerable. So, phone in one hand, kitchen knife in the other, I tell the Zoom call that I'll be right back and then head out to make sure that everything is kosher. It's peak lockdown during all of this, so the streets are pretty much deserted, so I'd think I'd have noticed anyone wandering around. But there was no one, not a soul in sight. So I guessed, or rather hoped, that it was just some neighbor kids messing around, maybe looking for a wayward ball or something. About a week goes by and the whole window face incident has been at the back of my mind the whole time. For a lot of young women who live alone, the idea of being targeted where we're most vulnerable is frankly terrifying. So the prospect of that nightmare coming to life just didn't bear thinking about. I'm not saying I was on edge the whole time or that I lose sleep over it or anything, but let's just say I held my keys a little tighter in my fists whenever I walk down the street my apartment block is on. But anyway, at one point I head out to the grocery store to pick up food, and I ended up caught in one of those super long COVID lines that you're stuck in for like 40 minutes before you're allowed into the store to buy your stuff. This is on top of the fact that the store near me had implemented this dumb one-way system in the aisles in an attempt to stop the spread. My point is, a trip that would have normally taken like half hour ends up taking more like 90 minutes, and an annoying amount of my day has been completely wasted. So I'm already in a bad mood by the time I get back to my apartment, only to find that the front door has been bashed in. Apparently, there had been a break-in while I was out. If only criminals could work from home. It seemed obvious that it was a burglary at first. All my stuff had been strewn around, drawers and cabinets were opened and emptied. The TV was still there, along with my PlayStation, but most break-ins just go for jewelry and phones, I heard. Anything small that they can pawn easily. Obviously, I called the cops like there and then, who arrived within a half hour or so. They advised me to help them look around the apartment for anything that might be missing, valuable electronics and whatnot, but I told them I already looked and that nothing obvious seemed to have been taken. My bedroom looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Clothes had been strewn all over the place. Whole drawers had been pulled out and flipped, like whoever broke in was looking for something. One of the cops spent some time looking around in there before he called out to his partner. "Hey, we need forensics up in here," is what he actually said. I asked him what the deal was, if he'd found something that I should know about. Both cops had been warm, friendly, and helpful up until that point, but when I asked him why forensics was needed, one of them told me not to worry about it and to stay out of my bedroom for the time being. It was no big deal at first. I was just grateful that they showed up so fast, even if they did wear masks and insist on keeping 6 feet between us at all times. So by the time forensics team showed up, I'm out front of my apartment building talking to my mom on the phone. Only when I see what they're actually doing in my apartment, it triggers what I can only describe as a mini freakout. Guys in gloves and white coverall suits have been scooping big handfuls of my underwear into bags, sealing them, then taking them out to the truck outside. And then it dawns on me, whoever broke into my apartment had left DNA on my underwear. Now, I probably don't need to tell you how exactly they'd done that. The whole thing grosses me out too much for me to actually type it. But the thing that really got to me was, if I'd actually been home that afternoon, there's no telling what would have happened if some violent perv had actually gotten their dirty hands on me. But anyway, the story does actually have something of a resolution and thankfully a happy ending, because they had this guy's DNA. Police were able to match it on their database with a guy who'd had multiple run-ins with the law for public exposure, among other things. He was arrested, and he's now looking at 3 years in prison for aggravated burglary, some kind of charge like that. But the whole thing came full circle for me in an interview with some detective who'd mentioned that this guy liked casing his victims' places before he struck. Over the past month or so, have you seen anyone hanging around your apartment who doesn't live there, maybe someone looking through your window? He said it. He literally said it. It was him, that day when I was in the Zoom call. It was him that had been looking through my window. He'd been stalking me for God knows how long, and when it came for him to actually get me, only by the grace of God was I lucky enough to have been out grocery shopping. Otherwise, it doesn't bear thinking about what might have happened. One of the worst things that's ever happened to me involved a website called Omegle. I was really shy back when I was a junior in high school. I had lots of anxiety and not so many friends. Not through any fault of my own, though. My parents used to move around a lot for work, so every so often, we'd just pick up sticks and move someplace new. This played absolute havoc on my social development for a while, and by the time I joined this new school during my junior year, I not only couldn't find the confidence to speak to people, I just didn't want to either. Like, what was the point when I was probably just going to move somewhere else within 12 months? But saying that, I also craved social interaction. I wanted it so bad, but just had no idea how to get it in any way that didn't turn me into a nervous wreck. And that's when I found Omegle. At first, I only ever used the text option. There was no way I was going to put myself on webcam for some total stranger to see. I talked to random internet people about politics, video games, pretty much anything, and after a while, I really started to feel myself kind of coming out of my shell. And it wasn't just text chatting with people online. The thing that did it was being able to learn to take rejection. Every so often on Omegle, someone would get bored and just ghost me. Maybe they didn't like the conversation, maybe they didn't like me. Whatever it was, they'd just up and disappear. First few times it happened after a decent amount of conversation, it really got to me. Total anonymity brought out some really cruel sides to people, but it somehow also brought out the best in them too. I'd have some real heart-to-hearts with complete and utter strangers, work out complex issues I had with myself. Together we'd set the world to rights, and when it was over, poof, gone. I'd never talk to them again. I ended up talking to a handful of girls on Omegle too. At least, they told me they were girls. Either way, I got a flutter of excitement the first few times. A couple of them asked if I wanted to talk dirty, but I ended up leaving those chats on account of just not being proficient in it. Like I wanted to, but I just couldn't. Anyway, I kinda got over the novelty of it after a while. Hearing that someone was female became kind of a non-issue for me. It was pointless trying to practice talking to them online anyway. I knew I'd freeze up if we ever met in person. But it did happen once more for me. That kind of butterflies in your tummy feeling after talking to some random stranger for like an hour and a half one night. We didn't talk about one particular thing. We talked about everything. In this long, rolling, intense conversation that was as intelligent as it was amusing. I was actually pretty sure the person was a guy given some of the hobbies they claimed to have, so you can imagine how surprised I was when they said they were a girl. I was kind of speechless. Only once had I ever gotten the inkling to actually ask someone for their personal contact info so we could keep the conversation going, and that person had ghosted as soon as I asked. I wasn't about to risk any more of my pride like that again, especially when I was certain that this girl in particular would make all the rejection pain come flooding back all anew. So anyways, I find out they're a girl, get excited, but choose to basically ignore it. Not only was I sticking to my never fully believe someone online is a girl until you hear their voice or see a verification picture or video rule, but I really could feel myself getting overly excited that this was actually a girl. Like if it was a girl, then she was like my dream girl, and that wasn't something I thought I could face right then, as weird as that might sound. So I keep the conversation going like it had been, and suddenly I find myself actually kind of flirting. I was probably doing it really bad, but for the first time in my entire teenage years, flirting was something that actually felt sort of natural. The whole thing was going so well that after we happened to both name Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls as our favorite book, I just thought, screw it, and asked if she wanted to talk over webcam. If it was a dude pretending, or she wasn't who she said she was, then fine, I'd cut my losses. But if she was, we tried to line up a little text countdown to us flicking on our webcams, which ended up being goofy and incredibly inaccurate, but it was still kind of cute, and helped me get rid of what little anxiety I had left. And when I saw her, wow, she was gorgeous. Legit one of the prettiest girls I'd ever seen to this day. And after some initial blushing and awkwardness, we carried on our conversation like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her name was Emily, and I've never crushed on a girl as hard as her ever. We spent like another 2 hours just chatting like that, and the whole time I was terrified of getting disconnected or something. But I was still way too scared to ask for like a phone number or email or something, so I was just kind of stuck in limbo like that for a while until I could summon up the courage. She was a senior who lived a few states away, but that didn't bother me. So I tried to push the conversation towards relationships and whatnot, which gave me a way into asking her if she's single. She replies that she is single, but she might not be for long because she met this really cute guy. Obviously, I'm kind of disappointed to hear that, and I tell her I think whoever he is, he's a lucky guy. She starts laughing and says, "I was talking about you, idiot." And I think if I'd blushed any harder, I've gotten a full body pins and needles and everything but my face. By the time I regain my composure, I know the time is right to ask for her number. So, I think of a smooth way to ask her, one that's witty but genuine, then work up to nailing the delivery. When I think I see something in the window behind her, only it's light in her bedroom and dark outside, so I can't exactly see what it is. I ask if she lives with her parents. She confirms she does. Then I ask if it's on a ground floor apartment, and she says no, that it was a 2-story and that her bedroom was on the 1st floor. And that's when I start to worry, because if she lived on the 2nd floor, why did I think I could see what looked like a face just hovering in her window like that? And how do you even tell someone that, "Oh, we're having this awesome conversation, and I'm just going to be a jerk by telling you there's a face in your window, even though I'm not 100% sure of anything?" I carry on staring at the dark shape for a second or two, trying to make sure it's not just my eyes or my monitor playing tricks on me. Emily obviously noticed my change in expression and asked me if everything is okay. I'm like, sure, I just thought I saw something. She turns around, looks blatantly at the window, and then tells me there's nothing there. Probably just a smudge on my monitor or something. I look again. It's just black, so I put it down to all the adrenaline going through me and just assume I made a mistake. The conversation carries on for a while, then the same thing happens. I'm so sure that I see movement in the window behind her that I actually do just sort of snap and say, "Yeah, I think there's something outside your window." She looks outside again, laughs, and says, "Oh, you mean that big branch out there? Yeah, we have a tree in our front yard, and it's windy all the time. It's probably just that." We laugh, and it breaks the tension, but it also sidetracks my move to ask for her number, so I decide to work up to it again. But right when I get there, right when I'm about to be like, "So, what's your phone number?" I see movement yet again, just over her shoulder. Only this time, it's really obviously the window behind her, opening. Like I could see the white bars shifting really slowly behind her, and I knew well that it was no tree branch and that my eyes were definitely not playing tricks on me. That time I wasn't chill or suggestive about it. I just straight up shouted, "Emily, the window!" She then spins around to see exactly what I can see, which is a person wearing dark clothing climbing in through the open window. The webcam on her laptop was super low resolution, so I couldn't see much apart from Emily just disappearing from the camera as she screamed and ran out of the room, only to be followed by this dark figure chasing her at speed. I just had to sit there and listen to the most horrific screaming and shouting sounds I've ever heard. She was home alone at the time, so there was just one set of female screams and occasionally this rough bark of the guy who was chasing her. Then all of a sudden there was a really high-pitched wail before everything went deathly quiet. I grabbed my phone and called 911 frantically, not even thinking that I had absolutely nothing to tell the dispatcher other than, I think I'm witnessing a home invasion." I didn't know where Emily lived other than that she was in New Hampshire. I had no last name, no specifics whatsoever that could actually lead the cops to her location. In the end, I got so frustrated that I hung up. There was nothing I could do. I just stared at the webcam images of her empty bedroom, praying she was okay. I'm not sure how long I was sat there, so I couldn't tell if the cops showed up quickly or not, only that they did show up. I knew because I heard the sirens before I saw the flashing lights from the window of Emily's room. I heard them break into the house. Then I heard them shouting stuff like, "Police, show me your hands," and other garbled stuff. And I actually heard gunshots, maybe 15 to 20 in all. It's hard to say for certain, but it was a lot. I actually stayed on camera until I could get a cop's attention and told them that I'd seen the guy breaking in. This ended up with me getting a call from a New Hampshire detective, but once I told them that I only seen one person break in, and that's all I'd seen via the webcam, he pretty much lost interest. Then I asked if Emily was okay. He sighed, and I could hear him putting on his professional voice before he even really spoke. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this one, kid, but Emily passed away this morning after you two spoke. I'm deeply sorry for your loss, but be safe in the knowledge that any information you give me will go towards catching the guy who did this to her." Not exactly what he said, but you get the idea. I figured it was just a robber, someone who wanted to subdue her before he emptied the house of valuables, but he killed her. The guy did things to her, and then he killed her. He didn't even run once he'd done it either. He stuck around to carry on doing things to her until the cops showed up to shoot him when he must have rushed them or something. Must have had a weapon. For days afterwards, I searched the internet for articles about a New Hampshire murder and home invasion, and God help me, I found one. And that's why I know so much about the details of what had happened, and how this was about 6 or 7 years ago, and they still haven't caught the guy who did it. I do have hope, as must her family, because guys are getting caught years later when the cops get a lucky DNA match or something. But given how much I got so attached to Emily in that short period of time, knowing that there was so much special spark between us, and then hearing her final scream, that's been something that's messed with me for years, and I still take anti-anxiety medication all this time later. I think my time using Omegle was like the golden years of my social life, because now I'm back to just not getting close to people. Not because I can't or I don't want to. This time it's because I just don't have it in me to form meaningful attachments. But I know just how easily people can be taken away from us. Y'all remember that thing Omegle? I don't know if it's still as popular as it used to be, or if there's just another version of it that people use, but for those that don't know, it's a website that puts you in a completely random, one-to-one chat room with people, either just text or with webcams too. When I was in my final year of high school, me and my buddies thought it was like the greatest thing ever after we talked 3 rando girls into flashing us one night. So as thirsty as it sounds, that's all we did for like a whole summer. Just chilling in one of our friends' mom's basements and just burning through different people all night. It got to the point where I'd go on Omegle sometimes when I got bored at home. Not to talk to girls as such, just to kind of mess around and see who was online. But I don't go anywhere near that site anymore. Not after seeing the most messed up thing of my life on there. Something that reminded me that the internet is still a pretty dark place sometimes, and that sometimes you can just happen across something seriously messed up, just on accident. So I have my webcam on, and I'm on a roll of just closing chat after chat. Everyone on that night was either a dude playing with themselves, a lonely weirdo, or someone legit mentally deficient, and I was just about to close that browser window out of sheer boredom when I see something that catches my eye. It's a girl, kneeling in a room lit solely with red lights. My first thought is that I might have gotten lucky, and that I was in for a little bit of a show. But then I saw the plastic sheet underneath her. Now, as crazy as it sounds, I had seen something like that before, when this older woman in a mask had a plastic sheet down and was urinating on whatever the stranger in the chat asked them to. Me and the guys had a good laugh at that one, but it was obvious that the idea was to make us laugh at that time, or some other strange interests. But what I ran into that night was most definitely not designed to be humorous. I'm still watching it, wondering who this girl is, why she isn't wearing a mask when she's basically completely uncovered. Whatever was about to happen, though, she sure seemed nervous about it, like she was visibly shaking and trying her best to hide her face, not that she was doing a good job of it. It seems really dumb in retrospect, like the whole thing was giving off the worst vibes, but my dumb horny brain has me still thinking that this is some kind of weird fetish, and for some reason, when this masked dude appears on screen, that just cemented it for me. Some kind of weird BDSM thing was about to go down, and I wasn't mad that I was going to be the rando person to get to watch it. The dude walks up to the girl and puts a black bag over her head. She squirms a little, but other than that, I think she's still just nervous. Or maybe she was acting like that as a show for the audience. I mean, heck, maybe the dude liked her to act like that, who knows? People are weird. The dude then disappears from view before reappearing with a cordless drill. He makes a show of this, having a finger on the tip of the drill like a magician would all, "This is a real blade" type thing, and then walks around the back of the girl and grabs her by the head. Only then do I start to realize that this isn't quite what I thought it was, and that maybe, just maybe, I should close the freaking chat before I see something I end up regretting. But there was something about the whole scene, something about the way the guy was acting and how the girl didn't try to run away. It seemed like a setup, like it was designed to freak someone out. Even the red lights were sus, like I remember reading about how old Italian horror movies would tactically use red lights on set to disguise how terrible their fake blood looked. Something about it meant I couldn't look away. So, I was watching as this hulking, bare-chested dude grabs the girl by the head. She's tiny too, and the size difference means his hand is basically wrapped around her entire skull. He then fires the drill up twice to ensure it's working properly, and that's when the girl really starts to panic. It was also, coincidentally, the moment I started to panic too. Either this girl was doing a very good physical acting job, or her fear was real. And if her fear was real, it meant the whole thing was real too. She starts flailing and struggling so hard that the monster holding her had to lock a knee into the small of her back to keep her still. The way they fell, you could basically only see her head and her legs kicking behind them both. Like I said, I was almost certain the whole thing was fake, but the part that made me really doubt that was what happened to the girl's legs when the guy started to push the whirring, spinning drill into the back of her head. First of all, there was the noise. It was absolutely stomach-churning. The sound of what could easily have been metal on bone just grinding against each other. But that could be faked, right? And there was this horrible mix of screaming and the drill's motor whirring, and the girl grunting as the pain started to hit. But again, could all be acting at the end of the day. What I'm almost certain you can't fake is the way this girl's legs started to spasm when the guy pinning her down started to really push that drill into her brain. They moved in a way that I don't think I've ever seen before, almost like people act in cartoons when they're being electrocuted. I got this sick feeling in my stomach, and I immediately closed the chat window before I saw anything else. The whole thing left me really shaken up. Everyone I've explained what I saw to says they think it was faked too. But then again, I'm almost certain that's because I feed them so much info on how it could have been fake and not really on all the reasons why I think it could have been real. I think I actually just want people to tell me that. Tell me, stop freaking out. You fell for some elaborate prank that'll end up on the internet elsewhere. Because the alternative is just way too messed up for me to quantify, and a part of me still does think that I actually did watch a live snuff film that afternoon. I want to tell you guys that I later heard the cops found a body with a drill hole in the back of the head, or even that I read somewhere that it was just a prank, or even a weird kind of viral marketing campaign or something. But the truth of the matter is, I just don't know. I never heard anyone else talk about the kind of thing I saw on Omegle that day, and I didn't ever go on that site again, so I didn't give myself a chance to catch a repeat performance, so to speak. I just try and tell myself that what I saw wasn't real, and that it was just an elaborate show to scare random internet strangers. That's what keeps the darker thoughts at bay when I'm reminded of it, and that's what helps me get to sleep at night. For a few years there, Omegle and chat roulette were like the best things ever. I know it sounds dumb, but the idea of coming face to face with random internet people absolutely terrified me at first. I wasn't the most confident of people when I was younger, and believe it or not, using stuff like Omegle actually helped me come out of my shell a little and learn how to talk to people. And naturally, like anyone who's spent a lot of time on Omegle, I have a lot of stories detailing some of the weirder encounters I've had on there. I mean, I've had some pretty amazing ones. I met one of my long-term gaming buddies on Omegle, and you'd be surprised at the number of girls who just want to show themselves off, so to speak, every once in a while. But I've also had my share of gross, sad, irritating, and downright scary encounters on Omegle too. And what I'm about to tell you is by far the most disturbing. And it's not some dumb creepypasta either. Every word of this is true. So I just gotten home from this terrible part-time job I was working in 2012, and at the time, my routine was like, get home, sneak one of my stepdad's beers from the garage, and see how palpable the mental illness was on Omegle that afternoon. I was actually having a good run at one point. I had a guy singing that Call Me Maybe song, another dude who did a magic trick, and a handful of pretty girls, and I think one dude was on acid or something. So all in all, I was in a pretty good mood by the time I hit end and knew for what turned out to be the final time of that night. Because when I do, I just see this dude sitting at his desk, staring blankly into the webcam. Immediately this hits me as unusual because most people are looking at their screens to see who you are and not straight up staring into the camera. I said like, "Hey, what's up?" or something. But the dude didn't reply, so I figured that there was just something wrong with his audio. Now I should add that it was usually around this time that I'd just end a chat and start a new one. If the person on the other end seemed too weird or like they wouldn't be much fun, I'd just skip them entirely. So as you can imagine, coupled with all the other weird stuff you're likely to see during an Omegle session, I ended up doing a lot of skipping. But something about this dude really got my attention. At first, when I saw him, he looked like he might be in his early to mid-teens, dark hair and eyes, kind of a baby face with scrawny shoulders. But the more I looked, the older he seemed to be. The guy had crow's feet, deep bags under his eyes. Pretty sure he had flecks of gray at his temples too. Like if he was as young as I thought he was, then he must have had the most brutal paper route in history. So for some reason, at a time I'd normally just ghost him, I said, are you okay, dude? Can you hear me?" He nods. He could hear me, and it hit me that this might be another case of someone browsing Omegle while they're high. It might sound a little mean or whatever, but I figured that I'd just mess with him just a little bit. Maybe see if I could guess what kind of drug he was taking. I start talking real slow to him, trying to make him think time is slowing down or something, but he barely reacts. And it's then that I realize that he hasn't looked at his screen or monitor. The whole time he was literally just staring at this little lens on his webcam. I break from the play acting and just ask him straight up, "What kind of stuff are you on, dude?" He just shakes his head. So I ask him if he means he isn't on any drugs at all, and to that he nods. Now I'm torn between laughing because of what could have been a blatant lie and kind of freaking out because if he wasn't lying, and that was him sober, that made for one real creepy guy. And then out of nowhere, this guy reaches up towards his mouth like he's about to take out some gum or something. At first, I think he's going to show me some weird root he's been chewing on that made him look all sleepy. I mean, if there is such a thing, I was just kind of speculating. I know people can get some pretty weird South American plants and stuff from shady websites. But then it becomes obvious that he has hold of his own tooth. His front tooth, I think. Like in the grip of his thumb and forefinger. And then he starts to pull. I respond, "Dude, what are you doing?" All calm at first. And then he starts really getting a grip on his tooth, pulling it and twisting it. And I respond, Stop! What are you thinking, man?" This all escalates until I hear like a deep cracking sound coming from this guy's mic. He twists the tooth free from his gum as blood starts to pour out of his mouth, then holds it up to the camera like he's all proud of himself. I am full-on squealing at the computer at this point, stuck between wanting to cover my eyes and turn it off, and not being able to look away because of what this guy is even doing. I asked him in like 100 different ways, "Why did you do that? Was it rotten? Can't you go to the dentist?" He doesn't say a word. He just spends a few more seconds smiling with this gap-toothed grin, mopping at the blood on his chin and holding up the tooth in front of the webcam. Then he disappears and I'm left on the new chat screen, just shell-shocked. Nothing has ever topped that for me in terms of just pure creepiness. Like, I have so many unanswered questions about that guy, and each time I think I get close to figuring it out, it just opens me up to 100 other questions. I mean, he would have had to have been on drugs to be able to pull his own tooth out like that. I don't think anyone could stand the sheer agony. And it's also the whole idea that it wasn't his first time doing it. As crazy as it sounds, he seemed to just know what he was doing. That he had to twist it and wrench it. He knew exactly how to grip it. And then the sense of pride at the end. It all just gave me this distinct feeling that he'd done that kind of thing before. I didn't see anything else that ever made me react so strongly, and after that, all the random guys just sort of playing with their junk that you'd see didn't seem to faze me at all. Like, as long as there wasn't any tooth pulling, it was just water off the duck's back. So, I guess I have something to thank Mr. Toothpuller for, although saying that, it's not something I want to see again. In fact, I hope I never meet Mr. Toothpuller online, or in real life, ever again. I used to work at a Starbucks here in Cardiff, and I've got to be honest, it's one of the better jobs I've ever had. The manager was brilliant, the other staff were nice and looked out for each other, so for a minimum-ish wage job, it was about as good as it gets. The only bad shifts to work were the first halves of Monday and Tuesday mornings, as the pre-work rush meant people were often at their absolute worst. I mean, don't get me wrong, people could be complete jerks at other times of the day or week, but the highest concentration of them was Monday and Tuesday mornings, without a shadow of a doubt. But rude customers aren't scary. Annoying and frustrating, yes. Chillingly cruel and calculating, not as much. Which is why this particular incident has stayed with me for so long, and I always seem to use it as my personal point of reference for how terrible human beings can be to each other. So, it's a Monday morning, and we're just coming to the end of the rush at around 9 a.m. 30 minutes more and the caffeine fiends will start to thin out and we can get some coffee and make a smoke break of our own. I heard her before I saw her. Like, she was only just trying to get a handle on what had been pure harpy screeches just moments before. Some woman was on her phone, ranting away and not looking where she was going as she tries to find the back of the queue. In doing so, she cuts off this other bloke who politely informs her that she's queue jumping. I don't know if she actually didn't hear him or was just tactically ignoring him, but either way, this bloke has to tap her on the shoulder before saying, "Excuse me, believe I was ahead of you." The woman just shrugs this off at first, giving the guy a gesture like, "I'm too busy to listen to you." I remember the look of anger on the guy's face as she gently but firmly grabs the strap of her handbag and tugs her out of the queue before taking her place. I'm a bit torn about the whole thing. Like, yeah, it was righteous, but laying hands on someone, I feel like there could have been a better way to resolve the issue. But it wasn't like the guy had picked her up and thrown her, and due to the size difference, that was definitely a possibility. Anyway, she reacts like this had been the case, like him actually standing up to her was some horrific incident of assault, and starts demanding someone call the police, even though she herself was on the phone and simply refused to hang up. A couple of staff members and customers managed to calm the situation down, and we get the guy his coffee before one of my colleagues serves the angry woman. I didn't serve her, but when she got her order, she turns to be like, excuse me, this coffee isn't as hot as I asked for." No, I know better than to just argue with customers and especially absolute whoppers like her. So I do as I'm asked and heat the coffee up a little bit more for her. I hand it back. She dips a finger in it and once again tells me, "This coffee isn't hot enough." Now bearing in mind, she just watched me run some steam through it, but again, I do as I'm asked and give her back some literally steaming hot coffee that she proceeds to absolutely overload with sugar. No wonder she was in such a stinking mood, Her entire life was probably one big sugar crash, hence why she was such an unbearable person to be around. But little did I realize, that coffee wasn't for her. And on her way out of the store, she took the lid off of her scalding hot syrupy coffee and threw it in the guy's face as he sat reading his newspaper. God, the sound of that guy screaming was absolutely horrific. Like I didn't actually see the woman throw her coffee in the guy's face, so I thought someone had broken a leg or something. That's the only time I've heard someone scream in pain like that. When my old skating buddy absolutely shattered his leg on this visit to a Bristol skate park one year. But what followed in the coffee shop was pure chaos. People were pouring bottles of water onto this guy's face, ambulance staff and police turning up. I think the woman legged it as soon as she threw the coffee because, to my knowledge, no one was arrested. But the guy who had the coffee thrown on him suffered life-changing injuries. From what another colleague told me, the gross amount of sugar in the coffee meant that some of it actually stuck to his face like a kind of molten hot glue. He'd been left with terrible scarring for the rest of his life, and all because he stood up to some absolute monster in the queue that morning. That's what I find really scary, that some people out there are so unhinged that a seemingly normal interaction with them could end up with you suffering injuries you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. Just one moment of misjudgment, one little enough is enough moment, and boom, you're going to look at a very different version of yourself in the mirror for the rest of your natural life. For the past few years or so, I've lived here in Redwood City, California. Back in 2008, some of you might remember that a Philadelphia branch of Starbucks asked 2 African Americans to leave because they hadn't bought anything. They were accused of racism, there was a whole bunch of fallout from it, and in the end, Starbucks announced that it would no longer ask anyone to leave their stores as long as they weren't causing a disturbance. From what I heard, this prompted a bunch of trouble with homeless people hanging around Starbucks outlets and generally making a nuisance of themselves, but I can't really speak to that because the only homeless guy that ever showed up in my local Starbucks was Steve. Steve was about as far from the stereotypical idea of a homeless person as you can imagine. I remember seeing him in relatively clean clothes, tapping away on a smartphone that was charging from a nearby power outlet and not giving him a second glance. I walked in, got my coffee, and carried on my way to work. The next morning, Steve is there again, paper in front of him, tapping away on his smartphone. Only this time, as I'm in line waiting to give my order, I see him reaching for a grubby-looking backpack that seemed to contain all of his worldly possessions. It dawned on me that he didn't have a coffee in front of him, and when I thought about it, he didn't have one that day before either. And that's when I realized that Steve was in fact homeless. And it was then that I actually noticed how tired he looked, how the skin of his face was stretched around his eye sockets like he'd skipped one too many meals in his time. Steve was obviously taking advantage of Starbucks' new policy in order to get indoors and charge his phone, and although he was technically taking up the space of a paying customer, none who got an inkling of his living situation ever seemed to complain. This was until one day when Steve got himself into some kind of confrontation with a customer. I think maybe one of his bag straps was lying in the way of someone because I only looked up in time after hearing someone apologize. This big guy in a bad suit scoffed as he sat down close by, shaking his head. "Shouldn't even be here," the big guy said. I thought it was quite an obnoxious comment, but I'm far too much of an introvert to say anything about it. Steve tried to apologize again, but the guy started going off on him, telling him he shouldn't be there if he wasn't a paying customer. And in a display of kindness that'll stay with me for the rest of my life, the guy at the head of the line bought Steve a coffee and a red berry cheese Danish. There, now he has something, so mind your business. It wasn't one of those, and then everyone clapped, moments. It was still incredibly awkward since no one wanted to get into a shouting match at that time in the morning, especially not me. So after the fat guy was shamed into silence, he just sort of wrapped his double-smoked bacon and walked out, avoiding eye contact as he went. That's when I found out his name was Steve, and every morning after, if Steve was in the Starbucks, I'd always say hi and asked if he wanted a coffee or a red berry cheese. Some mornings he'd accept, some he'd decline, and I came to learn that he used the charger and the free Wi-Fi to look for a job. He wasn't a drug addict, he wasn't an alcoholic, he'd just fallen on hard times after a nervous breakdown and was slowly building himself back up and putting his life back together. Learning that is how me and a handful of other Starbucks regulars developed a great deal of affection for Steve after a while, but our regular cheery encounters with him somehow made it easier to forget that he slept under Redwood Junction every night, and I guess assuring ourselves that Steve would be okay meant we could just walk away and not worry about it. Because one Monday morning when I walked into the Starbucks and saw Steve's seat empty, I automatically assumed it was good news. Maybe he'd found a place to stay, or maybe he'd struck gold in his job search, and I found myself asking the barista if they'd heard anything from Steve over the weekend. To my absolute delight, he told me Steve had an interview at a local car wash. He wasn't sure exactly what day, he just knew that Steve had made the announcement the previous afternoon before departing the store. So, that was the end of seeing Steve on my morning Starbucks runs. I hoped that he might show up again, buying his own coffee, looking healthier and happier, but he didn't, and I guess that was just fine. But at the same time, I'd have been lying if I said I didn't kind of miss him. Like I might have mentioned, I'm a card-carrying introvert, but I do enjoy a sense of community. I still enjoy the comfort of familiar faces, so anyone who makes me comfortable enough to come out of my shell, I appreciate that more than I think I can even describe. So after a few weeks of not seeing Steve at all, I decided to take a walk down to some of the local car washes to see if I could spot Steve. First place I asked hadn't heard of him, neither had the second place. But the third car wash I tried said that they were hoping I was the one who could give them the answers. You see, the third place I tried was indeed the same place Steve had an interview scheduled, but it was an interview he hadn't shown up for. I asked if he'd called ahead to cancel or anything, and the car wash boss said no, and that he just ghosted. And that's when I really started to worry. My concern for Steve's well-being grew to the point where I began to entertain the idea of going down to the Redwood Junction to look for him. I hope I don't sound too prejudiced when I say I found it an intimidating prospect. Like, as much as I appreciate that a lot of homeless people are just like Steve, good people who've fallen on hard times, I know that there are some people in the streets who are so broken that they do actually pose a danger to the general public. But as I said, my concern grew and grew until I didn't give good care if the sight of homeless people camp would upset my delicate sensibilities. A man's life was at stake. I needed to act. I wasn't sure I'd be able to live with myself otherwise. That was how I ended up cycling down to the junction one Saturday afternoon, where I began nervously giving descriptions of Steve and asking if people had seen him. People mostly shook their heads at me, looking at me like I'd grown an extra nose or something. I guess having visitors to the camp wasn't exactly a common occurrence. Time and time again, I was met with the same response. A shrug, a shake of the head, complete indifference. At least until I spoke to one much older guy who wore a Vietnam veteran baseball cap and a grimy old fatigue jacket. This guy seemed a little bit more with it than some of the other homeless folks, and although he had the distinct smell of marijuana about him, he was lucid enough to get a straight answer from. After confirming we were talking about the same Steve, this vet told me that he knew him well, but that he hadn't been around the junction in a few days. When I pressed him for where Steve might have gone, the vet shrugged, but told me Steve had left behind a bunch of his belongings. According to him, this could be a good thing just as much as a bad thing. When some homeless folks find a way off the street, either moving back in with family or getting a place in a program somewhere, they leave behind all their stuff. Some just don't need it anymore. A tent and a sleeping bag are useless when you have a room and a bed. But others find that the stuff they had on the street just reminds them of a time they'd rather just forget about. But sometimes, leaving all their stuff behind meant something bad had happened. I could see the worry just etched into the vet's face, and He seemed to be racking his brain for a moment before an idea struck him. He mentioned that Steve used to bring food to a girl who stayed on the other side of the camp, and that maybe she'd know where he was. Up until talking to that girl, my time at the camp had been unexpectedly uplifting. Sure, seeing people living like that was upsetting, but seeing how nice some of them were, how they hadn't let their hardships break them down, seeing them purely as the human beings they are, I have to say, it was quite cathartic. Yet the visit to the girl's tent was the point at which the trip became more terrifying than I ever imagined it could be. As we approached the girl's tent, the vet greeted someone nearby and asked if a person called Mouse was home. They nodded, but added that she wasn't doing too good. I wasn't sure what they meant by that, but on seeing this Mouse girl curled up in a fetal position in her tent, I was almost certain it was drug-related. The vet gently shook the girl awake, and I'm pretty sure she was high from the way she lazily opened her eyes and how out of it she seemed. But then as soon as the guy mentioned Steve's name, the girl shoots wide open, and she gives him this terrified look before saying, I told him not to go. I told him not to, but he didn't listen. Now he's gone. The vet asks her where. Where did she tell Steve not to go? She replies with, the cemetery, before bursting into tears. The last question we could get her to answer was what happened at the cemetery for Steve to be gone. She replied with, it took him. It. Not he or they. It. Hearing that word used like that caused this sinking feeling in my stomach. Not so much because of what it entailed, but because this girl was so messed up over what happened, and that obviously meant bad news for Steve. Before leaving the camp, I asked the vet what cemetery Mouse could have been talking about. I had my own idea of which one she was referring to. I just wanted to see if he had the same answer, and he did. He'd said he'd bet his last dime that she was talking about the historic Union Cemetery on Woodside Road. And I agreed because the historic Union Cemetery is right across the street from the hand car wash where Steve was scheduled to have his interview. I took all this information to the police, telling them I was a friend of Steve's before I had them file a missing persons report. I made sure to record the reference number I was giving, as I'd be able to use it to get in touch with whatever detectives would eventually be assigned to the case, I assumed. I tried all throughout that next week to get the relevant cops on the phone, but it seemed to take forever before the case was properly assigned. In the meantime, I thought I'd take a ride down to the cemetery to see if anything caught my eye. I don't really know what I was planning on doing. It's not like I knew anything about being a detective, but at the same time, I couldn't just sit on my butt and do nothing. So, for those of you that don't know, Redwood City's historic Union Cemetery isn't really a cemetery. It did actually function as one until about 1919 or so, but after that it basically became a kind of memorial. From what I can remember, some Civil War soldiers are buried there along with a few famous pioneers, so it's more for tourists and sightseers than grieving families or funeral processions. While walking up and down the gravel paths and checking out the old graves, it occurred to me that when the girl said, Steve is in the cemetery, it might have been her way of telling us that he was dead. There was every chance we just totally misinterpreted that, and I was in that cemetery on a complete fool's errand, wasting my time looking for something I wouldn't find. And if that's the case, what I found and saw next is completely irrelevant, and is naturally to be disregarded. But, and a big but here, if it is connected to the Steve disappearance, it raises questions that honestly don't bear thinking about. So, as I said, I'm walking down this gravel path, and a handful of people I see are just all checking out the statues, taking pictures, and all that other stuff. Only, I see this one guy, all by his lonesome, and he's walking with purpose, with a plastic bag in his hand. When I say walking with purpose, I mean he wasn't there just to hang around and check out the memorials. He was walking fast, like he wanted in and out in as short a time as possible. Just the sight of him filled me with curiosity, but it's not like if I rushed after him, he wouldn't freak out. So as much as I tried my best to follow him, he slipped away from my view almost as quickly as he had appeared. Only he'd left something behind the white plastic bag having just dumped it behind one of the bleach-white tombstones, apparently in the hopes that it would remain hidden from public view. At first, I was just mad. Like, who leaves their trash in a graveyard or whatever? But I went to check out what the bag contained. It just looked like a bunch of organ meat. Like I 100% saw something dark enough to be liver in there, and some of the other pieces looked like chunks of white fat. It smelled real bad too, like he might have been hanging on to it for a couple of days before he'd left it there. To this day, it's probably one of the weirdest things to ever happen to me. Finding a bag of meat like that, just abandoned in the middle of a ceremonial cemetery. And like I said, whether or not it's even remotely connected to Steve's disappearance is anyone's guess. I mean, the detectives treated me like I was crazy when I brought it up with them in the weeks that followed. They'd sent some beat cops out to the cemetery and they hadn't found a thing. But I also know they seemed totally clueless in their investigation, like they either didn't care about it or just couldn't get a lead anywhere. And that's just how things went. I get in touch every so often, only to be told the investigator hadn't progressed anywhere. It didn't help that it had taken weeks for anyone to report him missing, and the fact that it was me that should have acted earlier gave me this horrendous sense of guilt for the longest time. Steve had no family out here, and I barely knew anything about him. The best I could do was share the few slivers of info I had with the cops, then just hope it came to something. But it came to nothing, and now Steve is just one more name on the missing persons register, a missing persons register that stretches a mile long. The rate at which homeless people go missing around Redwood City is considerably higher than the surrounding areas, and given how difficult it is to conduct any kind of census or research among the homeless, that figure could be even higher than the numbers suggest. The trouble is, people just don't care. Even people who purport to care about social justice are content to focus their attentions on ridiculous niche topics when homeless people are dying and disappearing on the streets of California every single day. I don't know what's going on out here. Whether or not it's just fentanyl killing people off, some kind of serial killer, or something less explainable. But something is killing homeless people at a totally disproportionate rate, and all kinds of other weird stuff is going on to boot. I just pray that whatever it is can be identified and stopped before more people like Steve are lost. People who try so hard to tread water, only to end up slipping beneath the waves. At around 5:15 a.m. on the morning of July 6, 1997, a Starbucks employee arrived at work to open up the Wisconsin Avenue Northwest branch of the world-famous coffee company, situated just north of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of work to be done before the morning rush, and the employee in question had yet to imbibe their morning espresso to really kick them into gear. So, by their own admission, they were pretty groggy by the time they headed out back to one of the freezer units, intending to fetch some of the breakfast pastries that would go on sale that morning. But when the overtired staff member cracked open the freezer unit, they saw something that made their heart race. Inside was the frozen, lifeless corpse of 25-year-old night manager Mary Catherine Mahoney, along with the bodies of 18-year-olds Emery Allen Evans and Aaron David Goodrich. Although they weren't always on the same shift pattern, the employees knew his slain coworkers well, and the horror of witnessing their frozen, discolored cadavers was almost too much to bear. They raced out of the Starbucks and flagged down a bus driver who was only just beginning his morning route, and given how they could have just called 911 from the on-site telephone, running to find the comfort of another living person is very telling of this person's distraught state of mind. Within 5 minutes of the initial 911 call, police were on scene and taking stock of the situation. All three employees had obviously been herded into the rear freezer units before being shot, execution style. But what initially confused the investigation was that not a single cent was missing from the Starbucks. If the motivation wasn't robbery, then it looked a lot like a brutally well-executed targeted killing. But why on earth would someone ambush and murder 3 coffee shop employees during their routine night shift? What made the murders all the more shocking was that Georgetown has been traditionally a low-crime area of Washington, D.C., with local district council member Jack Evans saying To have a triple homicide anywhere in the District of Columbia is an unusual event, but to have a triple homicide in Georgetown is extraordinary, and this has never been a place where crime has been a problem. Over the course of that balmy July morning, scores of blue-uniformed officials made their way to the scene to look for evidence outside the split-level brown brick store. Homicide detectives and forensic technicians alike pored over the scene for hours on end after the bodies were found, working inside and outside the building adorned with the familiar green and black logo. They dusted doors for fingerprints, searched the store, and took statements from local residents in the hopes of piecing together what had happened. But it was only when Mary Mahoney's car was examined that further evidence was found, evidence which indicated that the murders were no random attack. Inside, the car was spotless, save for what looked like signs that Mahoney had recently spent time playing with a pet: a dirty tennis ball, a plastic chew toy, a dog's brush, and a red towel. The only possible indication that something had gone awry was a flat tire on the front passenger's side of the car, evidence that her attacker had made provisions to prevent her from fleeing. Mary was special, her mother later said. She had an enormous heart. She probably would have compassion for the person who killed her. When she moved to Washington several years prior, Mary would jog alone an hour before daybreak, never worrying about being attacked or assaulted. She adored animals, particularly horses, and even took in Marlou, her sister Molly's toothless black and white alley cat. She attended various New York colleges before graduating with honors from Towson State University near Baltimore, and was a loyal and active Democrat, interning for Bill Clinton when he was first elected. Yet, according to her mother, it was her managerial job at Starbucks that really excited Mary. She had been employed by the company for 2 years and enjoyed being the manager. She was often seen sweeping the sidewalk in front of the store and obviously took pride in her store. What she didn't enjoy, though, was disciplining employees, particularly one that Mary had recently dismissed for allegedly stealing several $100s. She struggled with the issue before having to fire him, her mother said, and for a long time, this became homicide detectives' main theory regarding the Starbucks shootings. Yet despite their hard work and determination, they came up short at every turn, eventually turning to the televisual law enforcement institution that is America's Most Wanted. After picking the case up, America's Most Wanted staged a thorough recreation of the murders and detailed many of the theories that police were toying with. They also advertised the number of an anonymous hotline, pleading with those with any information to come forward. And it seems this appeal struck a nerve with one member of the public, who called in with not only a frightening piece of information, but also a rather courageous proposal. In the hours following the broadcast of the Starbucks shootings, a woman called into America's Most Wanted hotline to inform them that she was dating a man who actually knew the shooter firsthand. This mystery person had confessed, even boasted, of committing the murders, and on more than one occasion. The couple had initially taken the man's word as pure bluster, but after seeing the Starbucks shooting edition of America's Most Wanted, it became apparent that he might just be telling the truth. The woman then left her name and numbers so she could be contacted by DC police, and when they did so, she actually agreed to wear a wire for them, in the hopes that she could catch a confession on tape. It was then that they learned their suspect's name: Carl D. Cooper. Cooper lived in Prince George's County near Baltimore City and just on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. itself. He was the son of a church deacon who lived with his wife and son, but at the time, he lived anything but the wholesome life of a family guy. At the time of the Starbucks shooting, Cooper was being charged with attempted murder in a 1996 shooting of an off-duty police officer in Prince George County. As for his family's complicity in his crimes, it turned out that it was Cooper's wife that purchased the 9mm handgun that her husband used to shoot the officer. It was the combination of this and his alleged involvement in the Starbucks shooting that led DC police to wiretap Cooper's home phone. He was arrested after making reference to several local shootings, but insisted that a friend of his named Keith Covington had joined him in the Starbucks robbery, and it was him that executed the 3 victims. However, When they caught up with Covington, they discovered he had been recovering from a gunshot wound at the time of the murder, meaning it was highly unlikely that he was even present on the scene, let alone the one to have done the shooting. "If I killed them, I'd say I killed them," he reportedly said. "But that's not me. I'm not saying I'm a saint, but I'm not going to go out and just kill people. You gotta be a dummy or a psycho to do something like that. It's pure evil." When confronted with the evidence of his lies, Cooper admitted to lying about his so-called friend's involvement because he killed 3 people and was afraid to go to jail. In the process of trying to avoid the death penalty, Cooper told the investigators he'd been staking out the Starbucks for about a month, confirming that he acted alone and fired 2 guns, a .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver and a .38 caliber pistol. Cooperating heavily due to the ever-looming threat of the death penalty, Cooper confessed to shooting the manager, Mary Mahoney, when she refused to give him keys to the safe, which held over $10,000 in cash. When she said no, Cooper shot a warning shot into the ceiling, which sent a terrified Mahoney running into the employee hall. Cooper pursued, caught her, and wrestled with Mahoney over her keys. But when her resistance looked like it would be too much to overcome, he shot her dead. He then shot the 2 other Starbucks workers at the store, executing one as they survived the attack and attempted to crawl to safety. Cooper later stated that he wanted to put him out of his pain and misery, but it's more than likely this thinly veiled attempt at showing he had a conscience was nothing but an attempt to dodge the first death penalty charge in over 30 years. During his trial, even when the relatives of the victims wept openly in court, Cooper remained chillingly composed. He also admitted to murdering a 39-year-old security guard named Sandy Griffin during a botched robbery. Cooper had helped Griffin at gunpoint before demanding that the security guard hand over their expensive .40 caliber handgun. But then, fearing Griffin would assault him in the process to defend herself, the serial murderer executed the security guard before quickly fleeing the scene. Cooper admitted to then selling the pistol on the street for $300. Once Cooper was convicted of the Starbucks murders and sentenced to life in prison, Griffin's relatives were no doubt pleased that their loved one's killer had been put away, but they expressed frustration that it had taken 3 more murders, maybe even more, before the killer had been caught. To them, a lack of urgency in the DC police force had cost 3 young people their lives and raised many questions regarding their competence and command. If the account of his defense attorney is to be believed, Cooper is nothing more than a career criminal whose shaky temperament and unbridled greed caused him to take the lives of the innocent. But time and time again, Cooper had the opportunity to simply take the money and walk away, yet he chose not to. He chose to kill people he just didn't need to kill, and he did this on more than one occasion. The first time might have been down to a simple rush of blood to the head, and it's a genuine possibility that killing the security guard was not part of Cooper's plans. But there's also a possibility that killing him proved to be something of a thrill that Cooper wanted to replicate in executing the 3 Starbucks workers.